feel like I need to high five after that. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the 13th annual CMS Real Estate Conference. My name is John Compson. I have the privilege of co-leading the CMS UK and CE real estate team here at CMS with Marie Scott. Marie can't be with us today, but hope she will be back with us soon. Thank you for coming. It's great to see so many people together. It seems like an awful long time since we had so many people in a room together, and it was great to hear that buzz of conversation. So welcome. And also welcome to everyone joining us online, both in the regions and internationally. It's great to have you with us. And it's nice to be in Convene's new space in central London and here at 22 Bishopsgate. Great new space. A quick plug for one of my partners, Barry Morris. Him and his team acted on the redevelopment and pre-letting of this space with AXA, so congratulations to them. It is actually fabulous space. We have a packed schedule for you this morning. We've got a combination of some wonderful industry speakers. We've got the out-of-the-box speaker. So for those of you who've been to one of these conferences before, you'll know that's just something slightly different. And then we have two keynote speakers. We have Anne McElvoy and Ruth Davidson. Now, for those of you who've presented at these... I just need to take a call. So for those of you who've presented at events like this before, you'll know how much preparation goes into these things. And as a speaker, you get your information pack and your instructions a few days before the event. So I received my instructions a few days ago and dutifully went through them. Number one, say hello to everyone. Hello. Number two, summarize the real estate market. How long have I got to do that, I ask? 2 minutes. So fortunately, we have some very good industry speakers who will be able to summarize the real estate market. And hopefully they can also cover the theme of today's conference, which is new priorities. Talking of which, another day, another set of UK government new priorities. Yes, we do have rising inflation. I think it's now gone over 10% today. Sorry, Jan, don't mean to steal your thunder. And rising interest rates as well. But it is quite extraordinary what our government has done over the last few weeks. It is scarcely believable. I did think about making a joke about it, but I just don't think it's very funny. I spent most of last week watching the news transfixed by the events. And by Friday evening, I was a little jaded and I sought some solace in something completely different. So I grabbed my recently arrived copy of the National Trust magazine. Crazy Friday evening, I hear you say. But actually, it was a really good read. And there's an article in there about something called the Castlefield Viaduct in Manchester. It's a derelict reminder of Manchester's industrial past. And the National Trust have brought it back to life and created 6 new gardens, space that people can just escape to. And it just struck me that the concept resonates with the ideas of new priorities in the real estate market. The idea of repurposing, the idea of creatively using confined space in an urban environment, and also just bringing community together. And let me take you from that very small example to a much bigger example, but satisfying the same criteria, which is Battersea. Now, Battersea, as you know, opened, or many of you will know, opened last Friday. It's a wonderful scheme. It's the space there, the mixed-use space, is quite extraordinary. They've done a fabulous job after having been derelict for such a long time. Another shout out to my colleagues Sarah Meldrum and Ros Hill, who acted on the pre-lettings of the retail space there. If you haven't been down there, get down there. It is great. So there are a couple of my reflections. I know you want to hear from our speakers. Before I introduce our first speaker, number 3 on my list of instructions was to just point out that if you want to know who else is in the audience, if you pick up one of these and scan the QR code, then you'll find out who else is here. Fortunately, I know that our first speaker is here. Jen Siebretz. Jen is an executive director of CBRE with 20 years experience, 15 years at CBRE. She heads up the UK research team there. Her focus is very much on big issues in the real estate world, identifying trends, analysing markets, and providing insight and ideas to help inform clients' strategic decision-making. Jen.
Thank you. I think we're all being trolled a little bit because there's a book behind us that says the Prime Ministers, and I'm not sure which Prime Ministers they are talking about. Look, I genuinely don't know how to start my speech today, but I don't know whether it's a really, really good time to be an economist or a really, really bad time to be an economist. I mean, it's an interesting time to be an economist, but normally I can come out and I can say, right, you know, these are our forecasts and this is what we think is going to happen, etc., etc. And people will kind of murmur and sort of say, well, how, you know, do you really believe that, or do you really think that's going to happen? You know, for once I can come out and say, well, actually, I genuinely don't know. I mean, who does know? And I was saying I've done 5 talks in the last week or so, and every single talk is slightly different. And actually, I submitted my slides for this talk on Friday, so they're probably woefully out of date, so I do apologise. So what I'm going to try to do in my very limited now 7 minutes is to go through and just talk about what we do know and just kind of sort of really just give you a little bit of background, because I think, in fairness, that's really all I can do. So one of the things we do know is there is a shed load of inflation. I mean, you referred to it earlier. It's now back up to 10.1%. That's the highest inflation for 40%. And this has really been affecting us, you know, from the last 18 months. I mean, it started off really due to the sort of, you know, massive kind of post-COVID pickup in demand that just couldn't be satisfied because we had massive supply chain issues, people still being poorly, and also through just the fact that we couldn't get kind of ships anywhere and things like that, and just couldn't produce the goods that we needed. But inflation is probably going to be a little bit lower than we thought it was going to be because of the energy price cap. So, you know, in the sort of end of the summer, we were forecasting inflation would end the year at about 14%. Now we're forecasting that it'll be about 10%. Now, that is just because of the price cap bringing it down to an average of 2,500. Now, that's not bringing prices down. I mean, that's still an increase in prices. They're still going up. So that kind of 4% difference, it just goes to illustrate how much impact energy prices do actually have on our inflation rate. Now, of course, we have got inflation going. We think inflation is going to peak at the end of the year, about kind of 10%-ish, and then gradually decline, finishing the year at about sort of 3%. But, of course, that doesn't take into account the fact that the energy price cap has now been changed and it's only in place till April. So we will have to go back to the drawing board again and have a look at our inflation forecasts for next year. So that is pretty difficult. And we were due to release our Q3 economic outlook this morning, which has been due to be released, quite frankly, every day for the last 2 weeks. But so hopefully we will have a look at that. I mean, we kind of just have to get it out. The other thing that we do know is that interest rates are increasing. Now, again, sort of 3 or 4 weeks ago, we were looking at interest rates being at about 3.5% next year. After the mini budget and after the market disruption that we had, we increased that to about 5.5%. Now, we do think maybe now that the markets have settled, now that the new Chancellor has reined back on all of these tax cuts, actually, it might be nearer sort of 4.5%. But they are going to be up and they are higher. And of course, a lot of the damage that has emanated from the mini budget, despite the fact that the Chancellor has reined back, and don't forget, he has reined back harder and faster than actually the new sort of fiscal measures that were going to be put in place. But still, a lot of the damage has already been done, and there's not a great deal that he can do to repair some of that damage. And of course, this is what is affecting people. Their mortgage rates have gone up massively. We got 6% or so on the SVR. That's the highest since 2008. And I know everyone, that's sort of my age sits and says, oh, you should have lived in my time. We had interest rates of 15%. You're all lucky. But actually, we are in a completely different environment now. And just, smaller increases in interest rates really does make a lot of difference. And this is going to, have quite a significant impact on the ability for some people to enter the mortgage market. And it's made people pretty depressed, quite frankly. The only good thing, I suppose, about the disruption in the political kind of development, shall we say, that has been going on, is it's kind of taken away from the news, from the cost of living. If you think, since April, every single news bulletin that you watched would have talked about the cost of living crisis. Now, I've never experienced this consistent messaging, over and over again. And actually, the last 3 weeks, we've kind of moved a little bit away from the cost of living and started talking a bit more about politics and what a bit of a shambles that it is. But both of these have impacted on consumer confidence. Now, consumer confidence is now lower than it was in the global financial crisis. It's practically the lowest it's ever been. What we do know, I'm not saying whether it's causation or correlation, but we do know that when consumer confidence is this low, we are heading for a recession. Now, one of the things I do have to point out is there's been a lot of talk around the fact that the latest sort of the mini budget and what's been happening in Parliament is causing a recession. That is absolutely not true. We know that we were going into a recession anyway. It was already on the cards. So, we have to give, credit where credit's due. They haven't actually caused a recession. They haven't helped, but they haven't caused the recession. Now, one really interesting thing, I think, is the labour market and the dynamics in the labour market at the moment. We have the tightest labour market since 1974. Unemployment is the lowest since that time. But it's not demand-led. This is supply-led. We've had a massive exodus, if you like, from the labour market. If the trend rate of employment had carried on, the rate that it was going pre-COVID, we would have about 1.3 to 1.5 million more employees than we do at the moment. So we've got this really, really tight labour market. What does a tight labour market do? A tight labour market means that people can push up wages. And wages have been pushing up to about 5.5%. We've not seen wage growth at 5.5% for donkey's years, but it's still not enough for people to feel the benefit in their pockets. We've still got declining real wages. So actually, we've got wage growth, which is pushing up inflation, but actually, it's not helping people. So it's like, the worst of both worlds. And this slowdown in real wage growth is adding to the woes. Now, one of the reasons, we've had this fairly booming economy, I know it sounds a bit ironic, doesn't it? If you think that actually the economy in the UK over this year will have grown faster than any of the other G7 countries, actually that has been driven by consumer spending. A lot of people have had a lot of money and a lot of savings in their accounts over COVID. I haven't somehow, but everyone else seems to have. And they're saying, right, okay, we're going to spend this money. And people have been, everyone's been cooped up. They want to go on holiday. They want to go out and spend money. They have to go and buy clothes because they've sat and eating the whole time through COVID. And so, we have had this spending. But actually now, we are finding that people, with the consumer confidence and the slowdown in wages and cost of living, actually people are getting a little bit more cautious about their spending. So the message to my husband is I'm going to carry on spending because it's good for the economy. So I think, if you see my husband, then please, back me up on that. But we do think that the UK is going to slip into a recession. Now, it's not going to be a large recession. We do think it's going to be a mild recession, but nonetheless, it is going to be a recession. So that's not great. But as I say, we do think it's going to be mild. We do think, as I mentioned earlier, inflation is going to turn around very soon and start to gradually ease back. But, of course, that does depend on the developments that happen in Ukraine. There was talk yesterday of explosions and the Nord gas stream. If Russia really pares back more on providing gas, and that is going to have a huge impact. There has been, a lot of fiscal stimulus. So, we do think that, it's not going to be cataclysmic. I can't say the word. You know what I mean. Now, this chart I had in as a, I'm very, politically neutral. And, what we do have to remember is that actually the focus that Liz Truss and her government had on growth is not bad. It's a good thing. I mean, no one is going to sit and say, well, we don't want to grow. We don't want our economy to grow. We genuinely want our economy to grow. And it hasn't been growing. We have really suffered over the last few years with austerity, and not enough investment into, production and infrastructure and things. And we do need to get that growth back. The issue was around the timing, and it was the execution of the policies that caused the issue, and around, particularly the fiscal responsibility and the tax cuts. It was kind of the fiscal policy was, competing against the monetary policy, and it just was all a little bit conflicting. So I'm going to turn to property very quickly. This is our monthly index. Now, this kind of backs up what I was saying earlier. We've already seen capital values have been falling slightly. My water. This has been since June, and this is, we were expecting, as I say, the recession, or a recession, not the recession. That makes it sound really bad, doesn't it? And what I wanted to do is I just wanted to compare the fall off in capital values at the start, so from June, the recent period, over COVID-19 and over the global financial crisis. And the dark blue, is it dark blue? Well, the blue that shows what's happening at the moment. Actually, you can see that capital values are declining faster than both in the global financial crisis and COVID. Well, if I had to put a positive spin on it, I would say that's really good, because actually we do need this kind of price discovery and repricing. And if assets are a little bit punchy, let's bring the value down, because then, investors, once they think that no one can call the bottom of the market, but once they think, we're kind of getting there, we will start seeing kind of opportunist investors coming in. And just to illustrate where the falls in capital values have been coming from, it's very much driven by industrial and logistics. And we know there's a massive boom in industrials and logistics over the COVID period. Perhaps, capital values got a little bit, inflated. We do still think the fundamentals are there. There is still some rental growth, but maybe just a little bit toppy in the pricing. And as you can see from this chart, that's where the majority of the yield shift has been. I wanted to show this chart, or these charts rather. These are just looking at the spread. So it's looking at property, are all property yields, and what's happened to, the 10-year government bond yield, which, we can use as a proxy for kind of the risk-free premium. And then the other chart is looking at the 5-year swap rate, which, again, we can use as kind of a proxy for the cost of debt. Our yields are going up slightly, they're going to have to start going up a little bit more because the spread is contracting. And as we know, as that spread is contracting, it's going to make investment in real estate less attractive. And overall, we think that investment volumes are going to be more muted. Now, this is one chart that I wasn't able to update. If you look at 2022 and 2023, just see them coming down a little bit. We are reviewing our investment forecasts, and we do think it's going to be weaker than we were expecting for all the reasons that I've spoken about. I think I've gone massively over my time, so I'm not going to go into this in any detail, but, suffice to say, the economic environment is really, really challenging. It's challenging because it's changing. It's changing on a daily basis, and, what do we not like? Uncertainty. And this is like, uncertainty on steroids. So thank you very much for listening. I don't know who I'm passing to or what the questions are, so I apologise for that. Thank you.
Thanks very much for that, Jen. I'm Abby Dry, I'm a partner in the Liverpool team, and our panel today to discuss new priorities in retail, offices and technology is Chris Hogwood from Landsec. Chris is Managing Director of Current Affairs and Sustainability at Landsec. Landsec own and operate some of the UK's most renowned retail and hospitality destinations, including Bluewater, Gunwharf Quays and Trinity Leeds. Chris has worked in leading communication agencies for the last 10 years, and before that, he worked in local government. We've got Daniel Kerr from Tokeny. Daniel is the co-founder and chief commercial officer of Tokeny. Chris is a genuine entrepreneur who mentored and funded several startups before creating his own investment boutique. Chris Kane from Six Ideas. Chris has worked in the corporate real estate sector for over 30 years, having operated as a partner at JLL, Vice President of International Corporate Real Estate for the Walt Disney Company, and Head of Workplace at the BBC, where he was responsible for the creation of Media City UK in Salford, the redevelopment of Television Centre, and oversaw the £1 billion development of Broadcasting House. Chris's latest publication, Whereas My Office, draws on his knowledge and experience in commercial property to investigate what the 21st century workplace needs to look like. Welcome the speakers, please.
You're in the middle. Can I stand up? Yeah. I might stand up if that's all right. Hello, everyone. Good morning. My name's Chris Hogwood. I'm the Managing Director for Corporate Affairs and Sustainability at Landsec. So that basically means I try and help our organisation make some good decisions, and then I try and make sure we get credit for it. I've got colleagues in the office who will let me know whether or not I do that successfully or not. Now, hopefully, I've got a slide. I'm going to talk to you about two of our new priorities as a business, two C words, and I'm going to try and bring them to life through two different places that are about 5 miles apart, both in South London. I say new priorities. I would say these are probably hardening existing priorities, but I think they're really starting to run through everything we do as a business. So on the left, this development here is called Timber Square. So it sits on Lavington Street in Southwark. If you draw a straight line back from the Tate Modern over Southwark Street, you'll basically get to it. It's really exciting to us as a business because it's effectively the next step in our journey for how we're going to be decarbonising our business, both in operation and in construction. So early on this year, we set out, as part of our refreshed sustainability strategy, some very ambitious embodied carbon targets through development. So by 2030, we are saying that all of our office developments will be less than 500 kilograms of CO2 per metre squared. So that's reasonably ambitious. We could probably go a bit more ambitious, he says, looking at some of my colleagues in the room, but we're definitely trying to set the agenda there. Now, the exciting thing is that building on the left, which is imaginatively called the Print Building, and one of my office colleagues is in the room. I don't know if he owns that name. It's not very imaginative. It used to be a Printworks. Calling it the Print Building, come on, guys. The really exciting thing is that building achieves 434 kilograms of CO2, so well ahead of our 2030 target. How does it do it? Well, we retain 85% of the structure. Turns out print buildings are pretty heavy things, so you can strip it back. 85% of the structure remains. You then build it up again with hybrid steel, with cross-laminate timber, which is about 20% lighter than standard materials, and that allows you to achieve a much lower figure. So why is that good? So obviously it looks good on the annual report, one of the things I have to oversee, so that's a nice tick. But it's important probably for two more reasons. And to my mind, they have equal weighting, and you can decide which one's more important. So number one, it's what our customers want. Now, all of you people will probably be aware of your own business's carbon reduction plans and the role the office plays in that. Increasingly, it's the thing that customers want to talk to us about. It used to be, I suppose, a sort of secondary consideration in leasing discussions. It's really front and centre now. How does this building help us achieve our carbon reduction strategies? Now, we've come out of the pandemic and there's been lots of questions about the future of the office and is the office dead and so on. I won't go into that right now, but I think what it has forced people to do is really think about why they have an office and what it's for. And if it's not aligned with your strategy, then what is the point in having it? And increasingly, ensuring that your office is part of your carbon reduction plan is a critical part of any real estate strategy. Now, one of my colleagues over there will probably ask this question even more, but I'm often asked by media, what's the green premium for being for an office rent? i.e., how much more can we charge our customers if this is a really kind of high-end green spec office? I actually think it's a much more existential question than that. If you're not prime and green and so on, you're in a much lower part of the market, and over time those offices are going to fall away. So this is going to be a huge endeavour for our entire industry. And this is actually why today we've set out something called our Carbon Manifesto. Now, I used to work for Alistair Campbell many years ago, and I was keen to call it tough on carbon, tough on the causes of carbon. I was overruled by my communications colleagues. Why have we set out that Carbon Manifesto? So we can't expect government to come around over the hill and fix this for us. So I'm not going to make any political comments too many political comments for the rest of this speech. You've got Anne and Ruth to do that later on, and they're going to be much better than me. Carbon reduction is a second-order issue for this government. It might even be a third-order issue. I don't even know where it ranks for this government. So the critical thing is actually those people that have a responsibility to take this industry to a new place, people in this room, need to own this part of the problem. And that's what our carbon manifesto is about. It's not about saying that we've got all the answers. It's about saying this is what we are doing, this is where we see the problems, and this is where we think we can work together to do some really great things. Because if we don't do it, no one else is going to do it. So that's my first C word, carbon. So my second C word is community. So on the right-hand side of the picture, hopefully you can see that is Lewisham Shopping Centre. Now, I don't know how many people have been to Lewisham Shopping Centre. We are going to do hands up. Who's been to Lewisham Shopping Centre? Well done, guys. I'm proud of you all. Lewisham Shopping Centre is somewhere that's really dear to my heart for a number of reasons. So I was born in Lewisham. I was kicked out of that shopping centre when I was about 12 or 13 for skateboarding. Still not sure if I'm actually allowed back in. And we're roughly the same age. Let's just sort of say early 40s. And I know what you're thinking. The shopping centre looks a lot better than me. Thank you. That's very kind. Now, the shopping centre is serving parts of the community really, really well. Lots of people go there for groceries, for a certain demographic of the audience. It's an incredibly important asset. But long term, the thing it was conceived to be, a shopping centre, it's just not going to be forever. The demand isn't there. So we, as Abby was saying earlier, we have lots of different prime retail destinations across the UK. So Leeds, Bluewater, One New Change, and so on. And we're seeing brands wanting to go to those places, but not to these kind of secondary locations. So it doesn't mean that all brands desert them. It just means the prime brands that really help you drive value and so on and create that sense of destination experience just aren't going to come here. Now, as Jeanette was saying earlier, that is a case of, yeah, there are challenges with that, but once you get your head around it's not going to be the thing it was, that creates new opportunities, and you can have a genuinely interesting discussion about reimagining the town centre. So if you've been to Lewisham Town Centre, you'll understand that the shopping centre really dominates it. It basically is a big road around it and not much else besides. But what if the shopping centre was a different form? What if it was more permeable? What if it was a greener space with more homes, fewer shops, but actually shops more driven by the sort of people that live there, more places to go out, more community uses and so on? And once you get your head around that, then actually it becomes a very, very exciting time for Lewisham. And that is one of the conversations we're having at this moment in time. So again, another sort of terrible political phrase that hasn't quite caught on locally. I'm trying to call this project Make Lewisham Town Centre Great Again. But turns out the Labour-led council is not so comfortable with that sort of Trumpian phrase. But we'll work on it. If you see it come through in some caps, then you'll understand I've won. Now, one of the things about reshaping a town centre is people feel ownership of it. I feel ownership of that place. My mum feels ownership of that place. She regularly has a go at me about any plans she sees in public because they're all wrong. So that's an issue for me to an important stakeholder, your mum. Never forget that. People feel ownership of it. They have stories, they have memories, and so you need to involve them in it. And that's one of the things that we're increasingly trying to do across our business, across everywhere we operate, is really push ourselves hard to involve the community in shaping the future of what happens next. So again, earlier on this year, we launched our community charter, which sets the standards through which we aim to do that, and which actually we want communities and politicians to hold us to account. It's reasonably ambitious, but it leads you to do some really great things. So in Lewisham, for example, we're running a great programme involving young people in shaping the future of the town centre. Highly recommend it to anyone who works in development. It's called Voice Opportunity Power. It was created by Grosvenor and a few other partners a few years ago. It's marvellous, and I recommend it to everyone who ever speaks about it. We're also doing a similar programme with pensioners who also sometimes feel quite left out of these kind of discussions. Turns out the things the young people want and the pensioners want are pretty aligned. We're also doing lots of stuff with design codes, and it's going to be a really long programme, kind of co-design and co-development. So why do you do this? So I suppose flipping my carbon arguments, it's definitely the right thing to do. For those, if you've worked in development in particular over the years, there's always been this idea that development is something that's done to people, not with them or for them. So the more you can involve them in that, the better place you're going to create, the more happy people are going to be. It's also the right thing to do commercially, because if you involve people in shaping a place, they're going to feel a greater sense of ownership of it, they're going to stay, and they're going to spend their money. And that's increasingly the thing we want people to do in our places, particularly with some of those quite scary charts that we just went through. So that's why we're doing that, and that's how we're helping them reshape the future of that place. But the other thing is we've got an asset now that can help people in the here and now. And so one of the things, and I'm really delighted to welcome anyone to Lewisham, and I'll walk you around these things. We've got lots of meanwhile uses in the shopping centre at the moment. They're around helping the community. So we have a wonderful organisation in there called Circle Collective, who work with young people who are far from the employment market. They get jobs and skills training, and then they get support applying for different jobs. We've got a wonderful scheme called XO Bikes, which is training ex-offenders to reshape bikes. And we have various other things from a Bank of Things, which is something the local community actually approached us about and said, can we have a unit to provide a place for people who are on the poverty line to come and just access things they can't afford? And so, yeah, the answer was yes, absolutely. We have this space, we can do it. Why would we do that? Well, because we're not just talking about the community as something that's distant from us. We are part of this community and we have a responsibility to it. And so that's the big motivation for us as an organisation. So I'll end just on this last thought, which I guess is kind of inspired by what Jeanette was talking about. Looking at UK society at the moment, we're coming to a really, really sticky time. One of my remits is thinking through the reputational risks to us as an organisation. I think increasingly there's going to be a question asked of business and businesses represented in this room here, which is, what did you do? How did you work to make lives better for the people that you are trying to make money from? And I think that's a really important question for all of us to be able to answer over the coming years. Thank you.
I realize it has to be in this direction. Good morning, everyone. So here's my presentation. So the problem with technology speech is always, how fast you lose your audience, right? So do me a favor, the moment that I lose you, raise your hand, so I will take that as a good indication of how to adapt my speech. Tokeny does what we call data-rich, highly performing financial instruments. Usually this is the moment where you all raise your hands, and I need to adapt my speech. Obviously, there is no lack of data in this industry. Data is everywhere. The problem is, how do you organize that data? Over the last couple of years, we've been realizing that the technology that most of you are using is Excel. So I'm not going to embarrass you and ask you to raise your hands if you're using Excel, but rest assured that you're not alone in this room to use Excel. Obviously, when you have Excel, your data is not capable of circulating from various databases, is not performing, and that obviously creates a high inefficiency in your operations. So you've all heard of blockchain, so let me make this straight. We don't deal with Bitcoin. Bitcoin is an application of blockchain. Blockchain exists for almost 40 years now. It became popular with the Bitcoin application that was released in 2008. Since then, we have more than 13 years that has passed, and we start to see how we can make use of that technology. And Chris, you're referring to your age. While preparing this presentation, I realized that I'm as old as the internet. So that says something. I need to share that information with my kids tonight. I'm not sure they will react. But if you look at internet, so it started in 1969. In 83 was the date that was declared as the birth date of the internet. And in 93, we saw the first browser, which really started to popularize internet. We have kind of the same timeline with blockchain. And rest assured that we will see the same development as we've seen with internet. As internet is the perfect infrastructure to share information, blockchain is the right infrastructure to share value. How are we going to make this happen? Well, you probably heard earlier this year, or a couple of years ago actually, acronyms like ICOs, initial coin offering, that became very popular. Well, actually, ICO were the first application of blockchain outside of those Bitcoins, and they came with the notion of smart contracts. Smart contracts are not smart, they're not contract, they are just programs that are built and written to execute some specific codes, lines of codes. And in the case of ICO, the specific code that it had to implement was what we commonly refer in the financial world as DVP, deliver versus payment. So you would not receive this utility token if you were not paying the cash. And that evidenced the capacity of the infrastructure. Now, we, in the meantime, Tokeny has been leveraging the same smart contract to start programming far more complex rules that allows us today to represent financial instruments in a compliant way on public blockchain. We also have the same smart contract that I use today to represent identities. Of course, identity, there's no data on the blockchain itself. What you have is anonymous claims that represent this data and enable the data to be represented on that digital decentralized infrastructure, and that enables that data to be enriched by third party. So what we're going to do with that? Well, I'm here to share a couple of buzz terms or words with you today. So DeFi. So DeFi, decentralized protocol finance, allows you to start having this data being actioned automatically by those smart contracts. Think about, for instance, real estate assets, which data would be represented on a digital twin on-chain. That twin would be fed with real-time pricing information that would in turn start feeding digital asset represented by token that could potentially automatically activate the sales of an asset in case of distress conditions, for instance. This is not something that is part of the future. We have signed yesterday a contract with Apex, one of our shareholders, and we are going to bring 1 trillion, you heard well, 1,000 billion of assets in the next 3 years on our platform that represent 1/3 of all the assets that are being managed by Apex today. So this is only the start. We have seen a couple of weeks ago protocol like Enzyme. You've probably never heard of Enzyme. Enzyme is a protocol that enables automatic allocation of assets for asset managers. So we have a pool of investors. The investment strategy is defined within the protocol. When the money comes into the protocol, it will be automatically distributed to the assets in the pool. So those are the type of technology that are being deployed now in production by a company like us and others. We have a partnership with a company called Invenam that provide real-time information on the price of those assets. That, as per the example I mentioned earlier, is enabling those assets to be data-rich and highly performing. No hand raised, so I guess that I've not lost my audience. Thank you very much for your attention.
Good morning, everybody. Uncertainty is the only certainty we're facing as we look at real estate here today and try and set some new priorities for the years ahead. If you haven't taken into account what Daniel has shared with us today, you ought to, because it will fundamentally change the way we think about our industry and particularly in relation to the office, in a sense. That if you look at it, the fundamental relationship between people and place has changed over the last couple of years. And that has a net impact on how people use and consume, certainly the office. And I think it plays out across all asset classes. So let me do a little experiment. Going out and talking to a lot of people over the last few years, I'm quite interested in the composition of the office. So show of hands, who here belongs to the property investment, the development, the property company world, the supplier of the built environment? Let's have a show of hands. Okay, so who here represents the consumer, the people who pay the rents, the tenants? Small number. Who here represents the world of policy making? Yeah, you'll fudge that one. Does that tell us something about how introspective, by and large, this industry is? In many cases, we are the world's largest talking shop, and we need to spread our wings and engage on a much wider basis and understand who our ultimate consumer is. The investor has always viewed real estate as a safe bet, covenant risk, and all those other risks were things you worried about. You need to be worried about it, because with disruptive industries such as this hitting enterprise, and we haven't even begun to talk about the impact of AI and the metaverse. But in terms of the systems we operate, CMS is a legal practice. What are you guys thinking about the impact of blockchain technology around implementing transactions, whatever? So the theme for today is new priorities. My first thought is we've got to move away from binary thinking, and we've got to start asking ourselves why on a much more regular basis. Because, ladies and gentlemen, our world, our beloved industry, is going through an enormous paradigm shift. And people have been arguing about this. You mentioned about the death of the office. The office is not dead, but the system underpinning it needs a damn good overhaul. And it's quite interesting to look at the range of speakers following us this morning in terms of the journalist and how they introduced their Bartleby column in 2018 to look about work and how managers manage work. And you look at their recent columns it's all about the place bit. Or if you hear from Martin, who's going to talk about the charity sector and about the fact that there's a crying shame that so many kids have to hop on a bus tonight because they've nowhere else to sleep. So I think this paradigm shift is going to be a whole raft of mini shifts. Analog to digital, we saw at the BBC in terms of we had to change because we moved from single channel world to multi-channel to 24-hour news cycles. I think we're going to fundamentally have to think about asset to service. We're going to have to get out of our silos and think about systems. We're going to have to think about portfolios to platforms, probably ownership to subscription, and clearly standardization to customization. So it'll be interesting to see what the BCO thinks about that. But most of all, consumers are going to want a situation where an industry can look at providing not static solutions, but on demand and subscribed. And I think also there's going to be a massive shift of what I call from ego to eco. And decarbonisation, I think, is going to be the order of the day. So we're moving into a completely multi-dimensional world, which for building owners, investors, whatever, is going to be a very difficult nut to crack. But the trends are there already. In terms of hybrid is not going away. It's going to be copper fastened in the demand profile for most organizations around the world. So that nature of demand is fundamentally changed. And regardless of the anxious calls by many CEOs to say, let's get everyone back to the office, people are simply not doing that. So how do you manage a facility for 3 days a week? We're really starting to think now about using technology, taking a leaf out of Daniel's book and going to a very different world where we think about platforms rather than portfolios. The whole risk factor has fundamentally changed. Who's to say there's not going to be another pandemic? I do some work as a board member in the NHS, and I can tell you now the COVID dilemma hasn't gone away, and there's a complete surge taking place in the last couple of weeks. What's that got to do with the duty of care of a landlord in terms of the buildings, particularly most of them being sealed buildings and air circulation and the like? So that's a dilemma. From an employer, from a C-suite perspective, it's how do I become an employer of choice, given what we heard earlier about the nature of the labour market in this country. And it's the same in many other countries around the world. We talked about CSR for years. We've done a lot of greenwashing and lip service. ESG is here to stay, and ignore it and your pearl. So lots and lots happen. But one of the things I would love you to start thinking about is how everything connects to everything else. Return to the office 100% is just simply not going to happen. So therefore, we have to look at all the factors that make up what sort of our world is changing towards. And I describe it as not only has the game changed, ladies and gentlemen, but the entire stadium. And that's why we have to take a long, hard look at our 100-year-old blueprint of how we do things and take it not at a market level, but at a systemic level, and understand that there's a huge adjustment of place having taken place virtually over the last 2 years. The big difference is we're all accustomed to dealing with market shifts up and down on geography. The shift in demand has taken place globally, and it's not going back anywhere else. And that's built a huge amount of momentum, not just in enterprise and tenants who sign leases, but in their workers. And that correlation between the worker demand for how they want to work, which has never been the place before. The employee-employer balance of power has shifted irrevocably, and it's not changing back anytime soon, which feeds into demand. But the elephant in the room, ladies and gentlemen, is not demand, it's revenue streams from existing portfolios. If you look at some of the banks are thinking of cutting 50% of their portfolio in the next 3 to 5 years. So that means the industry has got to roll up its sleeves and start to innovate like it never has before, and think about getting sustainability at the heart of everything we do. And we have to move away from our fixed mindsets and be much more fluid in our thinking. That gives rise to a whole raft of fear and vulnerability. Let's call it as it is, but there are huge opportunities there. And rather than being negative, I can see a remarkable renaissance coming if we put our minds to it and we're willing to move into it through 21st our mode. So we have to think multi-dimensional. This is no longer about the deal, the transaction, the portfolio. I describe it as something called omni-working, working any place, anywhere, anytime. And it's not about more flex. We were talking earlier about how Land Securities and other organizations have employed space as a service, and JLL forecast the market would be up to 30% of flex. I think it'll be 50 or 60%, if not more. But the parameters we're thinking about are binary, because what's emerging, and Daniel will, I'm sure, agree with this, is a whole new dimension of working coming out, which I describe as fluid, which is all about the impact of AI, the impact of machine learning, and last but not least, this whole new, unexplored, ununderstandable world, the metaverse. Witness what Accenture have done over the last few months in terms of putting all their graduates through their induction in an Accenture metaverse. The mind boggles, ladies and gentlemen. So we need to think about this in terms of 4 lenses, not just place, but people, technology, and leadership. And underpinning all of that is a real consideration to the stakeholder, the missing stakeholder in the room, that is Mother Earth and planet. Because we can't, as an industry which pumps out 40% of greenhouse gases and all the carbon, has the time arrived, ladies and gentlemen, to say that we've hit peak office? We don't need any more of them. Need we to be making better efforts to make smarter, more sustainable use of what we have, rather than burn more carbon? Is there a new role for bricks and mortar? So I think we've got to move our focus from beyond the physical. I think that's an anathema to a lot of people. I certainly took a long time to get my head around it. I think we have to think about a move from a capital to income model. There's no playbooks out there. You can't get McKinsey in to tell you what to do. So you're going to have to experiment and try things out and have the courage and strength of your convictions to try out different models. And I think most of all, we need to follow the 3 A's. We need to have a long, hard look at ourselves and we need to acknowledge that, in the context of offices, but I think of all of real estate, it's not dead, never will be. But we need to take the first step in the process of acknowledging that the system needs to be adjusted. We need to adopt our ways of thinking. We're all trained to generate huge value on the assumption that the consumer is always going to be there to pay rent. Those days are over. And we have to do and adjust our way of doing things, understand things like blockchain technology, AI, and a whole raft of other things. We need to get much more diversity into our industry, and we need to collaborate across boundaries. And I would leave you with one thought. Salek was the inventor of the polio vaccine, and I think his simple quote is, "We, ladies and gentlemen, are stewards of the built environment. We've all made a nice living. Some have made huge profits out of this. We've now got to start thinking very differently, because if we don't do that, people like Daniel and other disruptors will come in and offer a different model." So I would urge people, as you set new priorities today, to go beyond traditional thinking and to seek fresh perspectives. Remember, uncertainty is the new uncertainty, the new certainty, should I say. But we need to adopt creative adaptability to move forward. Thank you very much.
Wow, thank you, the 2 Chris's and Daniel. So I was very relieved to see Anne come through the door about 2 minutes ago. Let me just quickly introduce Anne. Anne has held many senior journalistic roles, including at The Spectator, The Telegraph, Independent, and the London Evening Standard. Presently, she's a senior editor at The Economist and a political columnist for The Guardian and The Standard. BBC Radio 4 listeners will be familiar with Anne through programmes such as Free Thinking and Across the Red Line. And she's appeared as well on a number of occasions, I think, on The Moral Maze. She's also familiar with TV viewers from Newsnight Review and Question Time. Her early years as a journalist involved reporting on the disintegration of Eastern Europe, the fall of the Berlin Wall, and the unification of Germany, which spawned 2 books, and makes her supremely qualified to talk to us today on global politics dominated, as we all know, by the Russian-Ukraine conflict. So please welcome Anne McElvoy.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Yes, that was a just-in-time delivery. We're talking about, what was it, omni-working, work from anywhere. In the present political crisis, I find myself either stuck in the Commons, if anyone's ever looked up to where the press sit in the lobby, but when it's full, it's completely rammed, and there's usually somebody standing on your toe or your knees to be informed by Penny Mordaunt last week that Liz Truss was not hiding under a table. So these are strange times indeed, and I thought what I would try to do is a bit of a whirlwind tour, and I'd like to talk and then get some questions, because I really like to hear what audiences are thinking. And particularly, I think, as you're at this conference and you're at the forefront of many of the shifts, as your last excellent session that I heard a bit of outside, goes to show about the changeable times we're in, but where we might find resilience and where it fits into the global picture. All of that will happen in record time. So I thought I'd just give you an insight about our news list this morning, from which we weave the analytical magic of The Economist, which goes something like this. A shock poll found Conservative Party members, who of course voted for Liz Truss only a couple of months ago, wanted her to go. A third of them wanted the old Prime Minister back. The Conservatives, no. Much as we loved him. Then there was a question of how Rishi Sunak, who lost, but I have to say, not by perhaps the margin that was expected widely, to Liz Truss, whether he could come back, but his own supporters told reporters that he was possibly too divisive to unite the country. The Halloween budget is on its way, so get your scare masks in early. We arrived at a point this morning where inflation officially reached 10%, but I think we know it and we feel it in our sectors, and we can feel the accompanying slowdowns, whether or not we're dealing with advertisers or whether we're looking into our own wallets, and particularly for those, of course, who are more vulnerable to the immediate impact of food prices. Food and drink prices are running about 14%, so that's even worse. So, of course, then you add the joys of, obviously, a Prime Minister who's perhaps not had the most strong and stable couple of weeks. I think we really have an epochal crisis in politics. And I say that very much as a veteran, not only of 25 years of writing political columns at Westminster, but also what came before. And when people say to me, well, there's a very fine line to a general election, or something really radical couldn't happen, and it doesn't work, the numbers don't add up, I always remind myself, and then rather bossily remind them, that when I covered East Germany in 1989, I watched first the country's economy really basically stop performing. I saw the pressures from underneath the mass movements that led obviously to people trying to flee from East Germany. I'm certainly not saying we're living in those conditions, but what I can tell you is if I look back at my cuttings, whoops, sorry, I stopped waving my glasses, I found one day the Central Committee had resigned, one day the Politburo had resigned. Everyone said, well, what's going to happen next? Well, who knows what happened next? The Berlin Wall fell. So the thing that you don't think can happen, can happen. This is a very good principle, I think, that we need to keep our eyes on, whether we're people like me who are commentators, whether we're policymakers, whether investors, that the likelihood and the pandemic and the impacts of the pandemic we just heard about are a very good example of that, that it is the underestimated event that can change the light. I'm not standing here now to say there's definitely going to be a general election, but when I hear Conservatives, senior Conservatives I was talking to at the weekend, saying there is an argument for getting this over with, seriously. And these are what we used to call the men in grey suits, who are now, of course, the women in much smarter suits. We are, aren't we, ladies? That has changed, but it is still, the fact is that there is a power, there is a core to the heart of great political parties, of which the Conservative Party remains one despite all appearances to the contrary, which will at some point have to move to lance a boil, which I think is becoming a real threat to it. There's one other reason there might not be a general election soon, I should say, in my sort of balancing mode. You can see I've been BBC for quite a long time. And that is, I mean, seeing as there's hardly any of us here and we're just having a coffee together. Now I was talking to Keir Starmer and his team only a couple of days ago. Whatever is said in the Commons, however much Angela Rayner calls for the overthrow of this dreadful government and the 12 years of Tory torture, Labour is not ready. It knows it's not ready, and it's not ready for what we should really come on to talk about, which is the impact of the low growth, stagnation, high inflation environment. They want power, but they don't want that. And trying to get through the next couple of months, 2 to 3 months at least, with strikes which now look more likely to go ahead than not, and behind the scenes I think there's been huge pressure on Unite from Keir Starmer's team, who do now look like the government in waiting. Seeing Keir Starmer around at a media event the other night, you had to fight off people who a few weeks ago would probably have passed him by and headed straight for the Liz Trussers, the Boris Johnsons, the Rishi Sunaks, who many of whom I think are residing or about to reside in the Where Are They Now file. So I think this is a big shift, but it does mean that on every score we have to take the economic challenge very, very seriously indeed. I would just point out that although there's a lot of talk about the reversal and the dramatic reversal that we've seen this week from Jeremy Hunt, who my old running partner at Oxford, by the way, he's very, very good at long-distance running. And it's only taken him about 30 years. And I say that, I'm allowed to say that. Why do you keep writing that? Because he has been a top-flight politician, but he didn't look really... I mean, did anybody here think he would be Chancellor and possibly even on the cusp of being Prime Minister? I mean, you can, if you did, you should come do my column one week and say, give me... I mean, seriously, did it? I take that as either you're very shy or as a no, because I think this is also a time when we will see figures coming to the fore, and I think we've seen it, by the way, in the broader international context, which I must leave time to come on to, is that people who we thought were maybe, okay, they reached along, the health secretary for a bit, culture secretary for a bit, but nice chap, never made it, find themselves with opportunity, which is a theme of opportunity in crisis, which, to be a bit more upbeat, I will allow myself to return to at the end. I think there is too. I understand the disruption narrative. It's absolutely true about what we heard about changing nature of work. I'm actually speaking at the Metaverse Summit next week in San Francisco, and I hope that by Friday I've learned to understand how to use the headset. So I get it, but in that I also see opportunity. I see opportunity for investors. I see opportunities for businesses. And although the Meta sounds like a completely San Francisco-based kind of virtual world of augmented reality, I think it is going to change all of our businesses. And I think we also have great opportunities here in the UK, where we do have a maturing tech sector, not only to do what we've focused on too much, which is the wonderful startups, but the startups to SME level, the SME to perhaps bigger. How do you get in a European country to an SAP? You don't always have to aim to be Google, but you don't only have to be doing it from a coffee bar or a WeWork with 8 friends. We have immense potential for growth in this country. So the question to me is how we get it. Well, we saw the Truss recipe fell a little bit short of its intended goal and kind of nearly brought down the entire UK economy because stuff happens. But now we do have, I think, a situation in which Jeremy Hunt has stabilised matters. You've seen 32 billion in that reversal, but that leaves a huge fiscal hole. And I understand absolutely why we've seen the measures that we've seen to plug that, but I don't think it is the recipe for future growth. And just to sort of, I happened to have my phone there today just to check on the latest, on the latest international tax rankings. Britain on corporation tax and other incentives is now not looking very good. And it is falling behind countries, Sweden is one that springs to mind, which have higher tax rates. So that is really the combination that concerns me a lot. I think anyone, whether it's Rishi Sunak, Jeremy Hunt, or anyone else who's free to run the British economy in the next 3 weeks, will be looking at that too. We will go through a period of pain. It's going to feel like austerity on top of a difficult winter of industrial relations, and they're going to be real sufferers. And I think, by the way, I feel this about myself and my own business, and if you do too, we do need to start thinking as businesses, what is our response to this, as opposed to going around and talking to each other about it? I mean, is there more that we can do to show that we get the suffering of people who are going to be more affected by it and, than many in this room? But that is, I think, it's something that we can get through. I think when you look to 2023, I should say, to be slightly more upbeat, I do believe 2023 towards the back end looks rather better. And that brings me to the international situation. I spoke about covering East Germany. I then went on, having caused the fall of the wall all by myself, to the Yugoslavia war, which was a consequence, a very unwelcome consequence of the fall of Soviet power in Eastern Europe. And I saw how quickly things can turn very bad that looked like they were stable. That brings me back to my, if you think that things are just going to go on as they are, well, stuff can happen and you must be prepared to factor that in. And then I went to Moscow. As you see, basically, I kind of took the train through Eastern European history. Why is that relevant now? Well, of course, you know why it's relevant, because of the Russia-Ukraine crisis. The Russia that I covered was emerging from communism. Yes, it was chaotic. Yes, it had a chaotic transfer and share sell-off, which led to the rise of the oligarch class and much that flowed from it. But at the same time, the most polite, considerate, reserved person that I had the pleasure to meet in those years, you know it's coming, was Vladimir Putin. And which maybe says that my judgment of human nature is not what it could be. But that sense at that time that this was a world, clearly the old Soviet state, the KGB structures that he represented were there, they were intact, and when the system of reform ultimately failed, he saw his moment to take back control, as someone once said, in a really dreadful way. And I watched that happen. You know, I was in the area, happily not in the buildings, you know, when apartment blocks were blown up so he could feed the Chechen war by blaming the Chechens. So what we've seen in Ukraine is a really long-term pattern, and I think we are now beginning to get real about it, and energy, if you like, has been the currency of our reality. The energy crisis, the impact of the Ukraine war, of course people like me care very deeply about it and feel strongly that we should support Ukraine to the utmost, but I also know that electorates are sensitive on this subject. If I'm in Germany a lot, which is one of my other countries that I cover very frequently, and there's still less than 50% of the population that supports toughening measures on the war in Russia. That brings me to where I think we're going to be on a much more changeable European environment. I have been in Berlin in the last few days, and the mood not only about Russia is very uncertain. I think it's been pretty good leadership by Olaf Scholz. Also, by the way, goes in my Jeremy Hunt category, who thought that he would be Chancellor. Angela Merkel was still the peak for many people of what a modern European states person should look like. The shine is off Angela Merkel, and I say that with some regret, having met Angela Merkel in the opposition movements in 1989. I think in many ways she's a wonderful woman, and I think she's been a fantastic example of a stable leader in the post-wall era. But if you ask about the big calls on Russia, on energy, and I think increasingly the policy shift in Berlin, as in the UK, on China, is going to be very telling too. certainly a lot of over-optimism and a lot of false bets were placed. Why were they placed? They were placed on a stability which was convenient but didn't exist. And if you were outside that orthodoxy, you were often seen to be either ultra hawkish or a bit stuck in the past, a bit of a cold warrior. But really, that would be if you were looking at it in your own businesses, your own risk assessments, you would be saying, well, we got that one rather wrong, wouldn't you? So that's my concern. I think where Europe is headed is into European politics, perhaps becoming a bit more like the tetchy relations that we've seen post-Brexit between Britain and the EU, what the Victorians used to call the relationship of Britain and Germany awkward cousins. And I think awkward cousins is now a bit more the mood in the whole of European relations. We've seen France and Germany probably about, they may get it together, but as of today, they can't even agree an agenda for their upcoming summit. Now, we talk about whatever mind you're of about European integration. If I'd said to you, a couple of years ago, I suppose I wouldn't have been here, but, we would have seen each other, the Franco-German relationship, the sort of mental image would have been like that. The economic policy was broadly aligned. There was the Macron-Merkel relationship, which was very strong. And I always felt that there were great strains here because I couldn't see how their economies aligned if we had another European crisis. But perhaps like a lot of people, I thought, well, they'll sort it out. We probably won't have one for a long time. Yeah. So I think now that this has happened, and now that we have an energy crisis, a cost of living crisis, and countries like Germany, I think, are deeply, deeply concerned about how their electorates are going to react. I know that we're having very difficult times, but I think, in some ways we have a slightly moribund electoral system, but we don't have quite such a reactive electorate as we've seen, for instance, in Italy with the appointment of Giorgia Meloni as Prime Minister. In France, well, somehow the French central state seems always to get a grip of it, but you've seen how close Macron has come to serious populist challenges. And when I say populist, I don't just mean like getting a bit Brexity and voting for Boris Johnson. I mean a kind of populism that would really disrupt, whether it's left or right populism, would disrupt economies and would disrupt the way that people are able to live and function. And unless you're a big fan of the degrowth movement, which is strangely, as you know, is a really sort of rather out there idea, the degrowth movement, but it does appear to be having a bit of a moment brought to you by a government which supports free markets. There's another of those strange paradoxes. So why am I a little bit optimistic? I think I'm a little bit optimistic for the following reasons. If we are to look beyond 2023, 24, some form of democracy that is electoral will continue in the UK, and it will be stable. It may be fractious, there may be threats, there are threats to the continuity of the United Kingdom as such, although I'm still perhaps more on the downside risks, I think, and perhaps not so great there, but it needs a calmer and a better environment for sorting that out. I think we may well, as it looks now, be seeing more of Keir Starmer, and more people, I think, will be placing their bets. And if you want me to come back and talk to you about Labour's economic plans, I'm very happy to do so. I don't think we have time to do it today, but I think we know that that looks more like the direction of travel. In some ways, that's not incredibly bad, because it means that you maybe have something that you can begin to plan around and you could maybe get curious about. So it's not a completely all over the place situation. It's a direction of travel. Beyond that, I think we have some things in the UK, and I hope to hear from you in a second, that I think will stand us in good stead. One is that the 10-year investment outlook that I'm hearing from investors in New York last week at an investor conference looks a hell of a lot better than you might expect. And I think that is because the intangibles of the UK, and I think we're talking here about London and the South East, but also that triangle, the Oxford-Cambridge-London triangle, which I very much hope that, with the Midlands and the levelling up can be brought into this. But I think we have to be realistic, and we have to go where there is growth and make more of it in order to have the growth to invest in levelling up. And that has been a huge argument in the government. I think under Labour, there is something of an idea which I am worried about let's take money away from the tech hubs, the life science base, because they've got it already, they'll be fine. And I worry about that. I think we have potential, and it will be in areas of the country you probably either built in or invested in, advised, but we've got it. We have a very good university sector. We need to be a little bit careful about bits of the university sector perhaps falling behind on what we just discussed on technology, on change and disruption. But I would say that, because I'm someone who likes to try to get out there ahead of disruption rather than say afterwards, hey, we're 10 years behind and look what they're doing in Stanford. But still, we are attractive, we are stable. Our politics right now is out there and it's a bit of a show. But I don't believe that this is the end of days at all for the UK. Ultimately, if I have to make a bet on the big, I'm sure I really should have mentioned China, I'll try to weave it into questions, but if I had to say that the world is now becoming a place where you can have systems which derive from a moribund Marxist-Leninism, on top of which you put globalization and a pretty hyper-charged era of capitalism, and have, along the way, amassed wealth, but are incapable, I think, of giving opportunity to their populations, because opportunity without freedom is meaningless. And you look to Moscow and you see when things go really, really bad, that you get simply a country, a leader with immense resources and no vision at all for the future. I watch Russian television, so you don't have to. And I have not heard Vladimir Putin, who speaks at length and often can speak well, speak once about his vision for Russia. It is encirclement, it is resentment, it is revenge, it is the other people are bad. We, in this world, are the bad people. But why the fixation? Why does the Ukraine crisis turn into well, this is all the fault of the West? It turns into that because I think there is great fear in the authoritarian megastates that in the end, as in the Cold War, the technological race and the race for prosperity will be won in the West. And so I don't want to be ridiculously boosterish, but I think London is very well placed in that regard. It can be a safe haven for investors, but it can be more of that. It can be an engine for growth. We have made one heroic mess of it under Trussonomics, but this isn't the last onomics. So I do think we can leave here this morning getting through a very difficult period ahead, but with an outlook for the UK, which I think is probably a little better than we're seeing reflected at the moment. I should take some questions. Take gentlemen.
Can the planet afford growth?
Yes. Could just leave it. Yes. I don't believe I understand the sense of your question, I think. I think, well, to put it another way, could the planet afford degrowth? No, because ultimately, to me, it seems that unless you really are of the view that you just want to live in a different social system, you're in a different social and political system, which does have a disadvantage that any attempt to try it has always failed, which might be telling you something, is, yes, you're absolutely right. We're in a dangerous situation, and the point made earlier on taking ESG seriously is also one that I agree with. But I'd say if you don't have growth, it seems to me you cannot find the means to tackle climate change. The bit that says don't grow, so what would happen then? So the damage that you've already got is there, it's in the atmosphere. You don't have the ability to tackle it, and you will have massive social unrest because people will not be happy because they're not growing. And why people, when you ask them, have a quite funny view of growth. I mean, the UK, we did some polling on it. It was a really interesting piece. It was about thinking, I don't really like growth. But they want everything that comes from growth. The health service, the roads, well, where does this come from? It either comes from that or it comes from some form of estate planning, and that just hasn't worked out. So I'm afraid I am very firmly on the side of grow. I'm a net zero supporter. I don't know that we'll make it by 2030. In fact, I don't think we will. But I'm still, I'm head there person rather than don't head there person. Should maybe just take something else. So, sorry. Sorry, the two people.
Right. I was just thinking, do you think a future Labour government would see the property market as a small group of rich people to tax more, and a larger group of savers that sit behind them?
So your saver point is on the mortgage pension
holders that fund development.
Good question. Think that through for a minute. I think fundamentally Labour will have a pressure, particularly from its younger demographic, to do a lot more on rental and to sort out problems in the rental market, which you'll all be aware of. And I think that that will be a way that they can, if you like, deal with their left base without going to crazy politics. So I think you're right that there's, and certainly second homes as an asset class. I'm quite interested in people kind of rushing into the hedge argument about investing. Because if I were going to be doing it purely as a hedge, and my timeline was maybe not so long, I would be factoring in that Labour might not like the look of that. So I think you're onto something there. I think there's a concern, if you like, about speculation or people using the property market. It's just culturally being closer to the Tories is the truth. And, to say people, here have not thought about this. But, there's just been a neglect of thinking about Labour unless they can't be lucky enough to get paid to do so. So I think they feel rather alienated from the sector and from the idea of what the asset class and everything behind it can bring. And I think that needs massive engagement. To your second point, where there might be some relief, I think they will not want to look at the sort of governing for the whole of the country is a really important point. So mortgages shooting up. When I did question time a couple of weeks ago, and there was a poor woman in the audience that's made the news, suddenly she just about signed the mortgage and then it had gone into sort of stratospheric levels of an interest rate. And that is great for Labour. But Labour then have to have the answer to that group of people, the people, as you say, who stand behind it. I think what they'll try to do is have it both ways. They'll go very hard on the rental sector. They'll go after things that maybe look like more speculative use of property investment. But they won't want to come across as the party that doesn't support home ownership, because that, in the long run, has never gone well for them. And I think they'd be quite worried. Should I take something over here? Have you got any ladies who'd like a word? So we're all about the equal opportunities.
Oh, that's a good question.
Hello.
Yeah.
Thank you. I hope I didn't put you on the spot.
No, that's absolutely fine. So you mentioned then about Conservative, and you talked very much about Labour winning, but sorry. So, I was wondering whether actually there is no choice for Conservative. They kind of have to have a general election purely because they're in such a disarray. They almost need the chance to kind of sort themselves out. So my kind of question is, A, do you think that's necessary? And B, if it's not necessary, who would you think is going to be the next Prime Minister or next leader of the Conservative Party?
She's good, right? Straight to the point. I think that in a sort of normative sense, I think we probably should have a general election. I think we've now got into the sort of smashed glass bit of the unwritten British Constitution. There's a big argument about this between those who say, as long as Parliament, there's a majority, 80-ish, and Parliament is functioning, which it is. We've seen Parliament prorogued in recent memory. So, yeah, but that's not happening. Parliament is doing its thing. Penny Mordaunt is turning up, and the Prime Minister is not under the table. That's working. It's crazy, but it is, it's better than bombs and bullets, isn't it? So that is the argument against it. And of course, the other powerful one, which I, of course, discuss endlessly with my friends in and around the government, is the old turkeys don't vote for Christmas argument. If you've got 2 years on the clock, you go through a painful winter, or 18 months, it's getting shorter. Something could turn up. Politics is very volatile, as I hope I've tried to reflect. Turkeys don't vote for Christmas. It depends how unhappy the turkey is. And so, I think you're onto something, and I was a little bit pushing that line in our leader conference this week. There is a point where people just we should get out of this. The reason why you be careful about that timing is the more you go down, you will know this, it sort of works like investments, the harder it is to get back up again. So if you went down to one of those crazy, 30-point Labour leads, which there won't be, but, you wouldn't at the moment fancy it. You'd barely be a sort of Conservative MP from here to Chipping Sodbury. So I think that's worrying for them. I think they'll have one go to get Rishi in. Jeremy Hunter said he doesn't want it, my long-distance runner friend. I think he sort of knows what he wants to do. And he knows exactly what he wants to do. I think he'll get credit for doing it. He'll be a capable emergency smash the glass. We got him Chancellor. I don't think he feels that he can. He didn't do well enough with those 18 or so votes that he got among the MPs to command them, and I think he knows that. The person who's like nearly got it is Rishi. He did better than expected, Rishi Sunak, in the contest against Truss. He had a terrible start to his campaign when he told everyone not to believe in fairy tales. There's one thing you don't do is sort of come in and say, like, oh, life's going to be miserable. You know, over there's the jelly and lemonade, and over here is like a terrible life with me. But he was right. You know, he was right, but yes, no, I mean, God, look at, you know, think of your dearest frenemy at work. How much do we love people who tell us we're right? Not so much. So, but he was right. So I think he was right. Two, he's got the infrastructure support to get there. They would absolutely have to balance it with a Brexiteer. I don't see another credible choice. But I don't think that Liz Truss can go on. So we're into the if, but not when territory. And I wouldn't underestimate, you know, on the sort of things just go. She's, you know, so I feel like Liz Truss for a lot of years, you know, professionally. She's having an awful time. She, you know, psychologically, the strain of this is so great that as in the last days of Margaret Thatcher, different circumstances, you know, different levels of competence. But it's somebody in this case, you know, Dennis Thatcher was the only one who dared to go to her and say, you know, go girl, you know, you've had enough.
That was going to be my follow-up
Yeah.
question. I mean, from a mental health point of view,
Yeah, I think it's worrying.
fair that they're actually putting her through this. I think it's...
She doesn't want to go. No, she doesn't. But I agree, and I think this is something Cabinet Minister said to me, which I thought was smart. Actually, I was like, well, it's either she's going to go in the next couple of weeks or she's not going to go for a while. And he said no, this wasn't what he'd seen it happen before. It's the next crisis, which I imagine will be after the fiscal statement. But who knows? You know, crisis could come up any minute. Hope you've got your coffee break sorted out. But this has been what my life has been like for 2 weeks. Excuse the throat. So I agree with you. I think there is potential for it going like that. But I do think his point, I won't name who it was because it was on the cabinet, was yes, the next time people just say, oh, I'm sorry, it just cannot happen. And then there will be, I'm not even sure acclamation, but I think we will see a group is clearly being put together under Graham Brady, you know, the eminence grise, the sort of the wizard behind the scenes at the 1922 committee. And one thing Graham knows how to do is organise a coup. So he's done about 3, you know, that I know about. So I think that there will be a group of people and they will say to the MPs, this is it. It's Rishi, Penny, to give you the Penny Mordaunt, who I think did very well in the chamber this week. And I think even the Labour people I was talking about the other night were like, gosh, she did all right, you know, given that she had nothing to go on. They will have to balance out that ticket and they'll put in other Brexiteers and people, you know, who were on the Boris team, who I was sort of called Reg Bloke, you know, just, we can't quite remember who they are, but they were Brexiteers. They're perfectly decent. They're not high, but they will need to be there. I mean, you see it a little bit in the cabinet. Already around James Cleverly, that sort of, you know, who's that person, you know, as far as but they'll need that, but they ultimately, the top needs to be secure. And I think that's what they'll try to do. I think, am I over time? I can't quite tell. Would you like one more question? And then if it's, I think this, okay, why don't we take the 2 and I'll go as fast as I can.
Yeah, given that a lot of the Western countries right now are sort of in their internal chaos, where do you view in terms of China and the fact that are people just sort of ignoring them because they're so, you know, inward looking right now?
Can I take that? Great, I'm so happy you said China. The gentleman at the back still like to do it? Yes.
Can you hear me? Yes,
Yes.
There we go. You've spoken a lot about Tory party. Just wanted to go to Labour. And you mentioned Keir Starmer and the fact that now everyone wants to actually talk to him for once. Do you think that they are worried about actually inheriting this mess? Are they going to make a lot of noise, but they don't really want a general election because it's a big hole that we're sitting in at the moment? Being Prime Minister is not an easy job, as we've all seen, and you know, is he going to bottle it effectively?
Yeah, I mean, I think I had
noise?
sort of touched on it, so I will just go fast because I want to get to China, but I agree with that. But that said, they want power. You know, that is what it is to be one of the main parties that contest. They want power, they don't want it yet. What frightens Rachel Reeves, I can tell you, is a very, very skilled economist, former Bank of England economist, very, very smart woman is she's got Labour to the point where it's behind the growth agenda, your point about climate change earlier, sir, and she will be and supporting net zero. Yes, there's some tension there, but that's, she's got the party there. They're not off on some weird Corbyn-y thing. But she hasn't, I think, yet been able to figure out and to find the political economy message behind how Labour is going to get growth. So when I did this question time a couple of weeks ago with Bridget Phillipson, a very good North East MP, usually very good, and solid on television, sort of middle of the party. And the recipe for growth was it's all in the hands. It's about investing in working people and helping women get out to work by better childcare support. Well, these are really good things. But if I came into a room like this and said, well, there's my growth idea, I mean, I think you'd probably think you'd book the wrong person. So I do think Labour is not yet credible on this. I think they know it, and the timetable is now sped up. They thought they had 18 months to figure this out, bring the party with them, make sure Angela Rayner doesn't say the wrong thing. All that stuff, which right now, it's funny, but, could unbalance the markets again. And you don't want to be the Labour person who books the markets, because that's the Tories' job. So I take a point. I will conclude on China, because I'm very happy you mentioned it, because it would have been a big omission. I think we are not yet in any sort of settled mind about what to do about China. I think you're right. I think we're not thinking about it enough. I think the Russia-Ukraine crisis, in which China is clearly a player in the background, may even be a restraining influence on Vladimir Putin, but it didn't try to restrain him in the first place. We've seen the terrible events at the consulate in Manchester, which were really shocking, the beating up of a protester. That is where, because the UK is sort of institutionally weak at the moment, I think in ordinary times, that would have been the big diplomatic story. But in terms of the Chinese economy, I think Xi is probably taking China backwards. I think the attempt to cut China off and the tit for tat, but the slightly aggressive view of the trade war from Beijing with America, I should say, but we're in the slipstream, is really very difficult. It's difficult for China, but it is also gumming up the works of international trade. And I was at WTO speaking last week, and of course people want to talk about Russia, Ukraine and energy, but if you're a world trade person, China and the battle for the upper hand between China and the US is, I think, you're absolutely right to raise it. We don't have an answer yet. What we have is a holding pattern in which we've kind of withdrawn from allowing Chinese investment in critical infrastructure. The chip shortage goes along with that. I think we're probably quite right. I'm not keen to have WeChat on my phone these days at all. But I do think that, we will have to get used to the fact that a world in which China is more inward looking and that we don't have a globalizing recipe that includes China is going to be impoverishing. It may be that it's the right trade-off, but unless there's some major change in that relationship, or indeed that the Xi recipe seems not to have worked and China itself puts in a different form of leadership, I think that is probably one of the biggest factors in the global economy right now. Thank you very much.
And thank you very much. I think we could have kept you talking all morning. We are running over, but I hope everyone appreciates it's certainly worth listening to. We've got about 15 minutes now. If we can go for coffee and be back here about 11. So for all those listening online as well, that's 15 minutes. And if we can get back by then, that'd be great. Thanks.
Thank you, everyone. Hello, and a warm welcome back to everyone in the room, in Overflow Room 1, in Overflow Room 2, to everyone joining us online and internationally. My name's Chris Ray, and I'm one of your host real estate partners from the CMS Scotland team. We have more fantastic speakers lined up for this part of our conference. We will introduce them as we go. As our theme of new priorities would suggest, we're going to focus on, of course, real estate, but also insights into changing priorities, and on the UK as a place to live and to invest. So it's my privilege today to introduce you to our first speaker for this next part. Those veterans of our CMS real estate conferences will know that we always include an out-of-the-box speaker each year. This year we welcome Matthew Reid, who is Chief Executive of Marie Curie. Marie Curie is a charity well known to all of us, and almost everyone in this room, sadly, probably will have had some interaction with them at some point. I'm Marie Curie's CMS relationship partner, and we very proudly do a lot of pro bono work, and we have done for many years for Marie Curie. But why, I hear you ask, have we invited the leader of this fantastic charity to join us at a real estate conference? So Marie Curie has a surprisingly large property portfolio across its retail branches, headquarters, hospices, and its presence across our national hospital network. But that is actually not the reason Matthew is here today. This conference is, as you know, about new priorities. And not to steal Matthew's thunder, but no one is feeling that theme of new priorities across society more than charities like Marie Curie at the moment. And Marie Curie more than most because of what they stand for and what they deliver across our communities. So please, join me in giving a very warm welcome to the microphone to Marie Curie's Matthew Reid.
Chris, thank you, and good morning, everybody. And CMS, thank you very much indeed for inviting me to speak this morning. It's a great pleasure to be with you, and thank you for all you do in partnership with us, which we appreciate very much indeed. So thank you. So as Chris said, I've been asked to say a few words, so a slightly different perspective to have a think about new beginnings in society at the moment and new perspectives in society. So in my day job, I'm Chief Executive of Marie Curie. I'm also Chair of New Horizon Youth Centre, which is a centre supporting homeless young people experiencing homelessness in London. I'm going to try and say something about the start of life and something about the end of life and see how those two things might tie together. First of all, many of you will be familiar with Marie Curie, I'm sure. We're the UK's largest provider of end-of-life care. Roughly speaking, 1 in 10 people who dies today in the UK will die in our care. And we offer those services in people's homes and in hospices throughout the United Kingdom. And we try and do so in a way which is holistic and focused upon the needs of an individual person. And sometimes the needs those people have aren't obviously immediately obvious. I was in our West Midlands hospice a few weeks ago, and I was on a ward round, and the doctor said to me, look, we're trying to control the pain of this patient here, and that's why they've come into our care. So I went to see the patient and said, I gather we're trying to support you on your pain control at the moment. And he said, well, yeah, they are, but actually, that's not the most important thing to me. The most important thing to me at the moment is how I can reform a relationship with my son, who I've been alienated from for a number of years, and I don't want to die not having repaired that relationship. And we find time and time after again that actually the importance of listening to people and understanding what matters to them is actually then how we can come in and work out how we can work alongside people to work out how we can best support them at the end of their lives, and of course support their families. End of life care, I've come to experience, therefore, as a holistic thing. And one of the images I find quite helpful is, I don't know if anyone here is an artist or is a painter. I have a go sometimes. I'm not very good at it, I have to say. But if you've seen someone painting, you'll see they take quite a lot of care over starting a canvas. And often people who are painters or writers, there's that sort of starter's block of actually sort of trying to get off the blocks and get something on the canvas to start with. And then often people get into a bit of a flow and they start to paint away. And as people get towards the end of a painting, they actually start to slow down. it's as if the last bits of paint become all the more important because they somehow aren't just generic bits of paint, but just sort of slapped on the page of, oh, that'll do. They become really important as to what paint goes on to complete the picture. And I think there's an obvious metaphor here with human life, that as we go through life, the start has a significance about it. We're getting started, and then we go on through life and doing what we do and everything else. And as people get towards the end of life, actually how they come to see the edge of the picture at the end becomes even more important to them. So end of life and the start of life, in a sense, have become a bit of a closed loop in many ways as to how we can experience the human condition. I want to just take a little bit of time to think about what can we understand about some of the macro shocks now being experienced in the world, which we've referred to many times this morning already, and what that might mean for new developments in society. So if we just have a look back at big shocks that have happened to societies over the last 100 years in the UK, and I guess the two world wars clearly come to mind. There's some interesting reflections I think we can draw from both as to what effect that's had on society. So both events clearly cataclysmic, and at the time when people were in the moment, just very difficult to imagine a life beyond that event. And I guess we might relate to that a bit at the moment, of just there being so much disruption and so much discombobulation, of finding it hard to imagine society after some of the events which have been backing up over the last few years. Not just the last 2 weeks, I mean, COVID, arguably the exit from the European Union, the financial crisis of 10 years ago or so. When you pull those things together, these are unusual times to be in. But when we look back at these large shocks of the 20th century, what we also see is actually afterwards, there's a period of social discombobulation, social disruption, which in some ways the effects of that can be even more profound or as profound as the initial event. Some of the social shocks and deep poverty in the UK that followed in the 1920s, for example, following on from the First World War, and some of the shocks coming to the UK economy during the 1950s, in a sense were the aftershock of the initial shock. And the aftershock sometimes has a bigger effect on people's lives as the initial shock. There's also been times, though, of huge accelerated social change and sometimes improvement. So arguably, during the 1920s, universal suffrage accelerated rapidly, arguably as a result of the war, as a result of changes during the war. And the National Health Service coming in after the Second World War accelerated social change. So if we try and take that onto some of the shocks we've got at the moment and what we could say about society, clearly we are living through a time of significant social change and disruption at the moment. Sometimes said it's the vanity of every age to think these are the biggest shocks of every time, but this is the one we are living in at the moment. And for sure, coming out the back of this, and in reality at the moment, there are many people's lives in the UK which are becoming increasingly difficult. In our Glasgow hospice at the moment, my nurses who are going out to support people who are dying in Glasgow today are not just equipped with their medical stuff, they're now having to carry food as well and sanitary products, because we're finding more and more people just cannot afford the basics of life just to have a dignified human existence. So they're carrying with them more and more stuff to just help people have some human dignity about them. So there are enormous shocks coming which are having real life implications, we know, for many people's lives. But the hypothesis I'd just like to try and conclude with is there's also, I think, at the moment, opportunity for huge opportunity. When there's this discombobulation socially, when the kaleidoscope of life is shaken, there is the opportunity to try and land the pieces in a better shape. And just to conclude, two things which I'm going to try and leave with you, which are two things I think we could make significant progress on, which would be social progress to make coming out the back of this crisis. The first, with young people, is to have a tenacious focus on looking at young people's well-being. In the UK, we have the privilege, along with the United States, of bumping along the bottom of the 20 most industrialised nations for having low well-being and low mental health amongst young people. It's a structural issue in British society which we never really find a way around. One of the ways other countries have addressed this is to have a tenacious focus in public policy and also things like building policy and planning policy is what can we do to ensure that young people's well-being in particular is thought about and prioritised as we're thinking through this particular issue. really key thing we could do in the United Kingdom, and we could all do in every element, all the work we're doing, in whatever job we have on a daily basis, thinking about young people's well-being, how does it affect that and how can we improve it, would make a significant difference to many people and to the future of society. The second thing is to try and make sure that we complete the end of the life cycle with full dignity. Tragically, every day in the UK, actually every year, hundreds of thousands of people die on their own without proper end-of-life care. We at Marie Curie don't think there's any need for that in one of the largest economies in the world, and that is a problem that could easily be solved by making sure that we prioritise end-of-life care in the UK as well. The two things are linked. How a life ends is how the chapter of someone else's life starts, clearly, of their loved ones. And the two things linked together would make a significant difference to actually how we build a stronger society in the UK. Huge shock, huge discombobulation, huge disruption happening, having real life implications in the lives of many people, but also enormous opportunity at the moment for us to focus on what could be done coming out the back of this to build a better society. Focus on children's, young people's well-being, getting that right, and making sure that everyone has the very best end-of-life experience. Thank you.
Matthew, thank you very much indeed for your insights into new priorities in society from the perspectives of the wonderful Marie Curie charity and care business. Thank you for all you do. I'm Candice Blackwood. I'm a real estate partner and co-head of the CMS Life Science and Healthcare sector. We are delighted this year to have joined the real estate sector in top tier of Legal 500 and been recognised by our peers as a practice growing in strength and truly fielding specialists in both life sciences and healthcare in the widest sense of the words. Whether that's advising on complex commercial agreements between M&G investing into Birchgrove, who are one of the first senior living build-to-rent operators in the UK, or through to the real estate joint venture for the £600 million project between Moorfields Eye Hospital and UCL's Institute of Ophthalmology, for the sale of their current Old Street building and the development of a new world-leading centre at King's Cross for eye care, research, education and life sciences co-working. These projects are reflective of our new priorities in living and life sciences. And to help us explore these new priorities, I'm delighted to welcome onto stage our next three speakers. Firstly, Nick Sanderson, Chief Exec of the Audley Group, UK's largest developer and operator of luxury retirement villages. Nick is also chair of ARCO, the Association of Retirement Community Operators, and has been a tremendous spokesperson for many years for senior living. Nick, would you like to join me? Nick will be followed by Stuart Grant of ARC, which is nothing to do with retirement care. After many years internationally with Blackstone Real Estate and then Stanhope, Stuart is now advisor to Brookfield, CEO of the 700-acre Harwell campus of science and innovation in Oxfordshire, and also CEO of ARC, the Advanced Research Clusters. And finally, Alistair Meadows of JLL, who needs little introduction. Alistair has been board sponsor of JLL's life science sector from the very beginning and is now leader of the EMEA Life Sciences and Alternative Capital Markets team. Do you want to join us on stage, Alistair? And Nick, over to you to kick off this discussion, which will be interesting, on senior living. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Candice, and good morning, everybody. I'm always conscious when I talk at something like this where it's so much about innovation and technology and advances that I come and talk about older people, which always seems slightly regressive, which of course it absolutely shouldn't be, and is as much an opportunity as a challenge. I'm always tempted also to ask all of you who's looking forward to getting old. Right? I suspect not many of you, and you're not, more specifically, individually, are you looking forward to moving into a care home? Now, I had to say I deliberately picked the worst picture I could find. And there are some very good care homes out there. Candice, sorry, some of your clients. But that is people's perception. There's fear, concern, the whole community, the whole of society is worried about the end of their life. So maybe don't go into a care home. Go into sheltered housing. Again, the worst picture I could find. I don't know where it is. It's raining as well, which makes it worse. But that is what is out there. That is why you probably think senior living may not be the most progressive opportunity for diversity in your portfolios, etc. But actually, this is exactly why it is. Strangely, there are alternatives. Unfortunately, they're 12,000 miles away. So this is New Zealand. This is Ryman Healthcare. It's a retirement village. It's not my personal architectural style, but I've been there. It's a wonderful place to live, great housing, fantastic lifestyle, support for people in their own homes to ensure that, in most cases, they won't need to move out because care will keep them away from care homes. To a point where in New Zealand, nobody builds standalone care homes anymore. People live here. To give you a glimpse of what that could be, right? Ryman are the 4th largest listed business in New Zealand. They're the largest house builder. That's like me being bigger than Barratt. 60 villages. They have 60 villages around New Zealand. But just as an example, Christchurch, New Zealand, South Island, 60 villages have been built by all operators, 16 in planning, 12,400 properties. Population of 380,000, 75,000 over 65 and climbing inexorably, as in the UK. So 16.5% of people live in that sort of community. Just remember that number. And yet here, we have very little at all. We're still living in those first options, which is why we're all so fearful. And yet we have a social care crisis. Care homes are closing, have disastrous workforce problems, cannot meet the needs of the local communities that they serve, are therefore leaving people to be admitted into the NHS, who are then blocking beds when we have a 7 million waiting list. Not ideal. In the meantime, the other end of the spectrum, housing in this country is totally dysfunctional. Not necessarily because we don't have enough houses, but the wrong people are living in the wrong houses. Under occupation, 2.6 million empty bedrooms every night because of older people staying put for the reason that they're terrified of ending up in that sheltered housing or a care home. So the easiest thing is to deny they need anything at all, wait for a crisis to occur, and end up exactly where they didn't want to be, in a care home or a hospital bed. But remember that 14.5%? That would suggest, if we were going to get to where New Zealand is and keep people safe, at every level, every price point, every tenure, that's 1.75 million properties. You won't, I hope you'll forgive me for giving an advertisement of what we do, because there are examples in the UK. There are good examples. There's more and more of this sort of housing. So this is one of ours. This is Sunningdale Park, just opened. It's the old Civil Service Training College. The house is the clubhouse for, standing behind us, 100 odd apartments. A clubhouse that gives the sort of, think Soho House for retired people. It's often called that. And if you're a member of the club at Sunningdale, you're also a member of our other 18 clubs. So whether you live in Derbyshire or Yorkshire or Bristol, you can come and use these facilities. And it's all about health and well-being. Keeping people active and engaged for as long as possible solves most of the issues of aging, without doubt, both mentally and physically. It's our job to keep people out of care homes. But you'll see that is very much an orderly premium product, and we have 20 of those at different stages of development around the country. But for many, many years, my principal challenge has been to try and deliver that to a much more affordable market. So this is a scheme in Watford, under our Mayfield brand, just opened, 255 apartments. We sold a quarter of it. It's never been done before in the UK, in the private sector. We sold a quarter of it off plan, 40% of the first phase. First people moving in now, I think we had 30 people move in 2 weeks. And it's fantastic, I'd say so myself. What it's delivering in Watford is a mid-market opportunity for people who live in a 3-bedroom semi-detached house to downsize, move into an apartment of their own, have a fantastic lifestyle, and believe me, this lot do. It's like party central. And through that activity, again, through the social interaction that they have, plus the fact that we're there to deliver care to them in their own homes, both in an emergency and on an increasing level as their needs change, mean they will stay in place, hopefully, for the rest of their lives, and will no longer be frightened of what I showed you in the first 2 slides. Welcome to come and have a look. Any of you would love to show it off. We're very boastful of it. This is part of a programmatic joint venture with BlackRock. The first villages you saw in Audley are actually with Schroders and Octopus. And the theme of partnership is something that we're developing as an organisation, which we're going to come on to in a minute. So it is coming. I'm not saying yet that I'll be bigger than Barratt, but this is more needed than any category of real estate I would suggest you can think of. Forget student housing or built to rent. There's 12 million older people in this country. They've got £1.7 trillion worth of housing assets, and they don't know what to do, and they're desperate for a solution. It's been seen in New Zealand, it's been seen in Australia. Florida, arguably, is one big retirement village. This is going to be a massive category within this sector. What it offers is, as well as the development proposition, the opportunity to create very long, very stable, index-linked income, much prized at the moment. We have a government, well, we don't have a government, sorry. If we had a government, they are supportive, they have historically been supportive of this, because they recognise the benefits from both the housing market, freeing up family housing, desperately needed by families, making the housing market less dysfunctional. But they also recognise the need and the benefits of keeping people out of the social care system and ultimately the NHS. BNP have just produced a report, 13,500 new villages, I think that's 45,000 units, will probably see me out. And ARCO, which Candy's just mentioned, we're just about to produce a report that will say we need 50,000 of this type of properties in the UK across every price point for the next 10 years, and we still won't scratch the surface of where New Zealand is. So find yourself a partner. We're always very happy to talk, because this is going to be, I predict, because I would, the biggest growth area in real estate in this country for many years to come. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Nick. And thanks to CMS. It's been fascinating to attend this morning and listen to a number of the speakers, particularly Claire and Matthew, and I think just continuing with some of the themes that we've heard this morning, not least actually about listening and learning. I think sometimes in the real estate industry, we're quite good on the transmit, we're not so good on the receive. And so when I took on my role, which is to lead our life science capital markets activities in EMEA, I've spent the majority of this year listening and learning from an industry point of view, listening to subject matter specialists in terms of ultimately what are some of the structural drivers that is driving ultimately demand for life sciences. Within the real estate industry, life sciences has been grabbing a lot of headlines over the last couple of years. So I thought what I'd start with is to just look at what is life sciences. How do we define the industry sector? So it's the application of biology and technology to health improvements, and that's the definition from the Office for Life Sciences. But it's broader than that. It's actually the convergence of science, research, innovation, and technology. And if you take all of those diverse, knowledge-intensive industry subsectors, they have quite specific, ultimately, real estate requirements. I think it's important, as we've heard today, also to take an international or a global perspective. I've been fortunate to spend time in the US over the last sort of couple of months, and probably like we've seen on maybe the retirement living or indeed the broader living sectors, there are many lessons to be learnt from the US in terms of the evolution of what is still nascent or embryonic or emerging sectors in a UK context, but actually sectors that have been evolving over the last 5, 10 or 15 years in the US. The two key themes that I just want to leave you with today is around collaboration and partnerships. When we think about collaboration, I think we think back to the time, obviously, the depths of the pandemic, when we saw how fragile the health of our society was. We saw at risk in terms of the future of that society. But we saw fantastic innovation, and we saw fantastic collaboration and partnership between academic institutions, the public sector, and the private sector, thinking around, the AstraZeneca, Oxford University partnerships. And that theme very much continues through from a real estate context in terms of ultimately how we're trying to be a facilitator or an enabler to capture the growth within science, innovation and technology, and you'll hear more about that from Stuart in a minute. So what is the role of real estate in life sciences? Well, I think first of all, the important thing is to take a research and data-led approach. So as we look at how we identify the life science clusters, we look at non-real estate data points. We look at company numbers. We look at funding, both in terms of venture capital funding and government funding. We look at the strength of academic institutions in any single location. We look at transport links. We look at access to talent. And when you put those together, where we have looked at, from a European perspective, the established, advanced and emerging clusters, within that, the UK actually has a first mover advantage. Many of you will have heard about the Golden Triangle, London, Oxford and Cambridge. They're the only 3 clusters in our European cluster map that we classify as established. There are many others that are emerging or advancing, not least in a regional UK context: Manchester, Birmingham, Bristol, Edinburgh, Glasgow, and so on. But I think it's important also just to contextualize, where life science is in a real estate investment context. It remains a very embryonic, as I say, and nascent sector. There are only $2.5 billion pounds of life science real estate transactions in the UK last year, against a UK commercial investment transaction volume of 65 billion. So it's less than 5% of the total commercial market here. But it has huge potential. We talk about new horizons. Through our surveying of our investor and developer clients, it's been catapulted up to the top of the list in terms of a sector that people want to understand more about. How can they potentially deploy capital? And that comes back again to the theme of partnerships. And that's partnerships both in terms of the marriage of equity with expertise, and you'll hear again a great example of that in terms of what Brookfield are doing in the space and the launch of the science and technology platform ARC. It's also looking at specialists from the US, as we've seen in the living sectors that are now operating in the UK. Some of you will have seen in the press overnight the new joint venture partnership between Longfellow, PSP and Norge as a good example of newly formed ventures, whether that be around programmatic joint ventures or new operating platforms. The reality is there is a disproportionate amount of capital, though, targeting very little up and built and income producing stock. By our calculations, roughly a ratio of 10 to 1. So you have to create it. How do you create it? You either look to develop it or you look to convert assets. So again, thinking about the adjacencies with other sectors, office, industrial and retail, and we're seeing more and more of that in London as an example. Finally, I think just going back to this theme of collaboration and partnership, we have world-class academic institutions in this country. 2 of the top 5, Oxford and Cambridge, alongside Stanford, MIT, and Harvard, are ranked in those top 5 academic institutions for life sciences. So we have this competitive advantage, we have this first mover advantage. But we also see the ability here, if we can align and harness that power between the public and the private sector, between developers, investors and operators, to really put the UK on the global stage. We're talking about how do we return to growth, how do we return to productivity. The science and technology and innovation sector gives us that opportunity. And if we can create some, I believe, political stability, there is huge amounts of global capital that we've already seen that wants to invest in the sector. But there's competition. I was in Paris yesterday. We're seeing the emergence of new clusters in Europe, whether that be Paris, whether that be Munich, whether that be Berlin. So we're competing for talent and we're competing for funding. So unless we can create that alignment, we will see an opportunity potentially lost. In our recent US life science cluster report that we released in the last couple of weeks, I think the phrase that really stood out to me was, science doesn't stop. So in spite of all the volatility that we're seeing in the financial markets and politically and economically, the theme of science and innovation and technology continues. And so for me, going back to those themes of collaboration and partnership, looking at the role that real estate can play as an enabler and a facilitator, there is a huge opportunity for us over the next couple of years. And that is really for us as a real estate industry group to determine what we can make of it. Thank you.
Thanks, Ali. Nice to see you all. My name's Stuart Grant. I am the CEO of the ARC Group, which is the Advanced Research Clusters business. So imagine the scene. Early 2020, I'm in my wee cottage in Scotland, looking out the window of my study. I'm up there with my wife and my family, snowing, and me and my partner had just launched this thing called Core Life Investors. We had a vision to create a science and innovation real estate platform in the UK, and great idea, lots of press, felt quite good about ourselves, retreated to the cottage, and then COVID started. And we thought, oh my goodness, this is going to get a bit tricky. No deals, no investors, what can we buy, etc. And my wife came in and said, what on earth are you going to do? This is cataclysmic for our family. You know, what are we going to do? And I said, don't panic, I'm sure we'll be fine. Anyway, literally, the phone started ringing, and we, on the back of this press, science and innovation, real estate, to Ali's point, a lot of the world's largest investors and medium-sized investors started calling me, actually. Modesty aside, they called and said, look, we're reading about this platform you're setting up. Because of COVID, we think there's going to be a pivot of capital towards the life science real estate sector, and we want to talk to you. So one of them was Brookfield. Our visions aligned, and they were in the process of acquiring Harwell, which is the UK's leading science and innovation campus. And they said, let's try and work together and buy it, and then have an aspiration to buy more over time. So the next few months played out. It stopped snowing, it got a bit sunny, and we got some clever lawyers to help craft a joint venture, basically operating agreement. So we went to business with deal number 1, Harwell. Harwell, if you don't know it, please visit us. It's a 700-acre campus just south of Oxford. Hats off to the previous owners, a chap called Angus Horner, who was the previous chief executive, backed by capital by initially Goodman, then you and I. Did a really good job of moving it forward and advancing the cause of Harwell. And then Brookfield got involved with us, and we said, look, we want to make this even bigger and better. Harwell has 7,000 people. It's got about 220 organizations, all focused on science and innovation, not just life science. We also have a very big cluster focused on the space industry. We've got a quantum computing cluster. We have a very interesting cluster with about 80 companies focused on energy tech. So we kind of stumbled into this, a little bit of skill, but a bit of luck, like always happens. And we got involved, and we thought, my goodness, we've got a jewel here. This is really an amazing place. The brand wasn't that well recognized. So we started polishing the brand, getting the story out. We worked very closely with our partners at Harwell, particularly the UK government, STFC and UK Atomic Energy Authority, to really move the thing forward. And the cool thing about Harwell is also juxtaposed to the commercial joint venture at Harwell, we have £3 billion worth of national laboratories. So if you're a scientist in any of the fields I just talked about, it's highly advantageous to be based at Harwell because you can have open access to some of the world's leading national laboratory facilities. So that was day one. We institutionalized the governance of the business. We doubled the size of the team. And then we went around and said, what can we buy? And it's quite early in the kind of the frenzy of the capital markets in the sector. And we managed to buy Arlington, which is a famous UK developer. But if you went through their kind of core list of assets, they had 3 or 4 choice assets that we wanted to keep. Namely Oxford Business Park, Uxbridge Business Park, Manbury Wharf in Hammersmith, and a 400-acre site in Hatfield. The rest were non-core to our strategic vision. So we went about very quickly. We acquired the business for £700 million, and we started selling off their non-core assets with a vision to just keep those 4 assets I talked about. And then we merged the 2 management teams. We came up, the Arlington name sadly went, and we created the new name Advanced Research Clusters. We launched that about 5 months ago in the Science Museum. And great traction. So today, 2.5-year-old startup, we've got 60 people. We've got 1.6 million square feet of income-producing assets, all focused on science and innovation. And the neat thing is, again, I think you've seen a frenzy in the market, but we got in early, and we have land where we can develop another 5 million square feet. So we never need to do another deal. We can on the land we own or have options on, we can develop another 5 million square feet at an attractive yield on cost, 9 to 12%, depending on the plot. So it's been a fun 2.5 years. Brookfield are an amazing organization to support us. We love actually working with the UK government. We turn up at meetings with their scientific experts. When we're talking to a US pharmaceutical company, we go along with our real estate jockeys and talk about square footage and placemaking and rents and blah, blah, blah. But they come with their scientific experts as well. So it gives us real credibility when we're in the room with those organizations. In terms of the market, I'll wrap up quickly. The market remains at the moment quite healthy. So if you sat at the coalface of our leasing meetings, you would see a long list of organizations. This is particularly in Oxfordshire, who are looking for space. The strongest demand is from life science companies still, space companies active, energy, tech, and quantum. But we need to be, we're stewards of capital. We need to be sensible and sober, and we need to look to the US for some indicators. And if you go to Boston, just in the life science sector, year on year, VC activity dipped about 38%, and it's highly correlated to real estate take-up. So the market has cooled, which is expected, but it hasn't slowed. It's definitely, take-up is still there, so it's ahead of pre-COVID levels. And we still think that there's going to be strong demand. To Ali's point, science doesn't stop. We've got some very interesting conversations going on in Oxfordshire with large organizations who want to commit to 100, 150,000 square feet requirements. The other headwind in the sector is construction costs. That went up 20, 25%. Cost of financing, as we all know, has gone wacko. So the industry is definitely, it's really a sector in the UK that it requires development. You need to create stock, but right at the moment, it's quite hard. So I think the people who entered the sector in the last 6 to 12 months and overpaid for sites will have a bit of a challenge. We're lucky because we got in early and we've got some cheap land, so we can still create product. And Brookfield are very committed to that spec development program as long as the market conditions are there. So that's ARC. I just want to give you an overview of the business. Please come and visit us. It's a pleasure to be invited here to talk. And please ask me any questions afterwards. Thank you.
I think you guys might move on. Yeah. Look, it's fascinating to hear about those sectors. So thank you very much. Stuart, Nick, and Alistair, that was great. Look, as I say, we are running over, but I'm delighted to say we have Ruth Davidson with us today. Ruth is a member of the House of Lords. served for 8 years as leader of the Scottish Conservative Party and transformed the party's prospects in Scotland, leading it to its greatest electoral result in 35 years. She's a regular contributor to debates on gender, inclusion and equality, and in 2018 wrote, "Yes, She Can, Why Women Own the Future." Ruth is equally at home on Have I Got News for You?, our One Show, The Great British Bake Off, I don't think I saw you on that, Newsnight, Question Time, Andrew Marr, and obviously she's at the CMS conference. Of course, her close professional relationship with Prime Ministers and Cabinet members gives her a unique insight into the current political environment, both north and south of the border. Surely there can't be a better time to have Ruth Davidson with us in the room today. We're very grateful to Nicola Sturgeon and Liz Truss for providing so much material. And you only have 40 minutes. But ladies and gentlemen, Ruth Davidson.
Thanks very much. I'll just bend this down to hobbit size. Thank you very much, John. Yes, my name is Ruth Davidson. For those of you who don't know me, I am the former leader of the Scottish Conservatives. I stepped down in 2019, a few months after returning from maternity leave, a few weeks after Boris Johnson became Prime Minister. Pick your reason. I finished my term in the Scottish Parliament. I left last May and took up a place in the House of Lords. And I now, given that I'm speaking to a group of friends, I now consider myself a recovering politician. If you do know me, and I know that Scottish politics is quite niche, it's probably from one of the two referendum campaigns that I was part of. I was very involved in Better Together to keep Scotland part of the United Kingdom at the independence referendum, and I was also one of the people that did the big TV stadium debates on behalf of Remain at the Brexit referendum, arguing that economically, geopolitically and security-wise, the UK was better off staying part of the EU. So in terms of my record, I won one and lost one, which as a Scotland football fan, actually more than I'm used to. And I know that you had the excellent Anne McElvoy speaking earlier about the kind of global picture and the change place that the United Kingdom is currently operating in the world. So I'm here to give a bit more of the domestic focus. When I was chatting through with the organisers what they wanted from me today, we had the mini-budgets, but not the rollback. Kwasi Kwarteng was still the Chancellor. There was a suggestion that as we looked at the current domestic political situation, I could look and overlap into areas for your members here of changing workspace demands, of post-COVID issues, ESG, commitments, build requirements, and that we can definitely get onto that in the Q&A. I'll speak for about 25 minutes. We'll have a Q&A afterwards. But I think what might be more use to you as I stand here at this time today is to try and give you a glimpse behind the curtain, treat you as adults in the room as you have to make decisions on behalf of your own companies in the short and medium term, and just give you that kind of insider's view on what on earth has just happened, what on earth is happening right now and has happened since I've been sitting down here. I've been watching it on Twitter, and what the likely next steps are from the government. So firstly, let's go back to prehistory, summer, the leadership election and what happens to new prime ministers. Oftentimes, when a party is in office, the election of a new leader and therefore a direct prime minister that's untested is decided as an antidote to the perceived deficiency or criticism of the immediately departing prime minister. So if you think back, Thatcher was considered very high-handed and we got the very unassuming John Major. Blair was too slick, we got the very authentic, or considered to be more authentic, Gordon Brown. Cameron was too glib. He was considered a bit flighty for not sticking around. May would be more solid and diligent. May got bogged down and proved at the election that she was a loser, so Boris was considered a winner and would crash through any roadblocks. And then by the time we got to this election that we've just happened, the means of departure of the Prime Minister was deemed to be a deficiency of character. So of asking the public to do one thing while presiding over a team who partied while the nation locked down, who stood up in the Commons to say that no gatherings had occurred when they themselves had attended them. Someone who put someone with rumoured complaints of sexual harassment against them in charge of processing sexual harassment complaints. And all of that is a really, really long-winded way of saying that every Tory MP thought that the corrective, in terms of a new Prime Minister, was to have a more orthodox morality than Boris Johnson, a greater seriousness of purpose than Boris Johnson, combined with being a bit sounder on public spending because the Shires were grumbling about Prime Minister Johnson's big state conservatism. And pretty much every politician alive thinks that they are moral and that they are in it for the right reasons. Every Conservative, yeah, we were happy to back and indeed champion furlough and everything that we needed to do, but we were all concerned about how to balance the books. And I think that's probably why you saw just so many people put themselves and their names forward. By my count, it got up to 11, including people like Tom Tugendhat, who's got a great backstory, and Raymond Chisty, who's been in Parliament for some time, but who've never held any sort of ministerial office whatsoever, any sort of front bench role in either opposition or government, thinking that they can just become Prime Minister in a really difficult time. And I've been on the front line of Conservative politics for over 10 years, and I will confess to you right now, even I had to Google Raymond Chisty. I didn't know much about him. I don't think I've ever actually met him. Now, in terms of the mechanics of it, Conservative elections are in two halves. You'll have learned this in the last wee while. MPs whittle down the field to 2, and then the membership decides between those two. And those two phases, in combination, are supposed to provide the checks and balances, which is the first stage, showing who can command Parliament, and the second stage, showing who can command the party. But the problem is, these two stages don't happen in a vacuum. So when Liz Truss was originally backed, she was originally backed by 50 MPs out of 357. And if you can do your maths, that's 14% of the parliamentary party that thought she was the first choice. She was their third choice, so in terms of popularity, she remained third all the way through all the different voting rounds until the very last one, by which time the newspapers had already started running lots of stories about how the membership wanted her. They were demanding her. They didn't want to see a runoff ballot between Rishi and Penny Mordaunt. They needed to have a harder line Tory in the room and that she would do well. And the MPs decided that the membership needed to have that decision. But still, worth pointing out, within that final ballot, less than a third of Conservative MPs backing her. So what, I'm not saying that in any way to discredit her, but just to point out, as you see what's happening now, and as I talk about what's going to happen in the future, you see that she's never really commanded the Conservative half of the House of Commons. But into number 10 she went. And the first thing that you need to know about number 10 is that it is both personally exposing and physically cocooning. And that sounds like a complete oxymoron. But let me explain it to you. So I'm very lucky. I've not been in for a while, but I used to go in quite regularly. I was quite close to both David Cameron and Theresa May when Scotland was quite a big issue, and it was quite high up the agenda. And I was a regular attender of what's called political cabinet. And in fact, one of my oddest days in politics was sitting in the PM's outer office on the day after Theresa May became leader of the Conservative Party, but the day before she became Prime Minister. And the reason I was sitting outside was that David Cameron was running late because he was upstairs in the flat showing her around. And I had this amazing mental image of Samantha leaving a bottle of wine in the fridge for her, and David running Theresa through what the bin schedule was and what day the recycling went out. But anyway, the layout of number 10 is really, really odd. It's not a modern workplace that any of us would understand it to be. It's a very unassuming frontage, a very unassuming foyer, some quite grand sort of public rooms. The PM has a bustling outer office where a couple of walls have been knocked through, so it's bigger than normal room size because it was a house at one point. There's a decent-ish sized inner office, but nothing like your CEOs would have. Small offices upstairs, downstairs in the basement, tiny, tiny canteen, and the top floor I've only been in once. When you get to the flats, there is a blast door made of metal about that thick before you can get to your house. And you would think that it would be a bustling nerve centre, and it's not. I'm a journalist by trade before I was a politician. I've worked in newsrooms for paper, for radio, for telly, and they all have that same energy, that kind of surge, people making deadlines, having to make decisions, bang, 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 just driving a news agenda. Number 10 is not like that. It is a gentle hum where other workplaces bustle. But the decisions that get made there are really, really hard decisions, and they're the real judgment calls, because if it's easy to make, if it's obvious what the decision should be, it's been taken lower down the chain. It's really only the 51, 49% decisions that should come up to a Prime Minister, and the pressure on them to get those right in real time is immense. And it's exposing, and you cannot elect somebody hoping that they will learn on the job or hoping that their deficiencies will get better, because they don't. If anything, their deficiencies become magnified. And the reason I explained the layout of the building is to explain how easy it is very quickly to become cocooned. Because the thick walls and the quiet rooms and the packed schedule of meeting after meeting, being dragged here, there, quick brief, who you're in the room with, what you're talking about. Then you've got all the kind of set piece stuff. You've got to go to the UN, to NATO. You've got to do a remembrance service this day. You've got the state opening of Parliament. You've got this, that, the other. It makes it really easy to not hear the outside noise that we're talking about as normal people all of the time. And I think that's why it is so important that you have conflict and challenge within Number 10. And if the last thing that you need is a whole bunch of people who think like you, who have the same background as you, the same experience. You need people that are going to question and challenge, that will put the opposing view, and that will play devil's advocate. The British Army have a saying called train hard, fight easy. And when I was doing my officer training, that was exactly what we had to do. We made every exercise more complex and complicated than it needed to be, so that if and when it came to doing it for real, with real guns and real ammo in a real theatre of war, you could, and you had the toolkit to take decisions under fire and know how to fight your way through. And when I was party leader in Scotland, and it's a massive, massive difference in terms of scale and size, I'm not comparing the two, but in any leadership position, even in that situation that I was in, I would make sure that every time there was a set piece, like a manifesto launch or a campaign launch or a policy announcement or a big policy speech, I get a group of folk into a room who would play the part of a hostile press, who would kick the tyres, who would kick the crap out of me, who would drill me on what I needed to know, what were the numbers, what were the attack lines, what would Labour say, what would the SNP say. And it meant that when I got to stand up, I could defend everything. I knew what attacks were coming, I knew how to defend them, I had an answer to the incoming fire. And it's kind of really basic political communication 101. And I think when I look at the last few weeks, I've heard the Prime Minister, Liz Truss, admit to a number of mistakes. And I personally think the biggest mistake is not having enough dissenting voices in the room while decisions were being made, to criticise her, to challenge, to pick the plans apart. And I think also another one is not having the humility to make changes where you can recognise that the challenge is justified, where you can make the defence that you need to make. You don't have that foundation. And I'm not kind of just talking around the cabinet table, although I think that may be a problem. I am talking about the fact that so many of her advisors have been hired from the kind of same set of think tanks, from the Institute of Economic Affairs, the Adam Smith Institute, the Taxpayers Alliance, and the Centre for Policy Studies. Now, I'm not discrediting these people. They are all incredibly smart. They have done thoughtful jobs. They want the best for this country. But they've all been professionally schooled in the same political orthodoxy. And I think that is the problem. And when you have senior outsiders like the then head of the civil service at the Treasury, Tom Scholar, not on board and providing that challenge, he found himself sacked and out on his ear. So I think with all of that backstory, that gives you maybe an understanding of what the shock and panic was when the mini-budget bombed, and how slow and how heavy on their feet the government was to kind of response to that criticism. And I said just a few moments ago, number 10 is hugely personally exposing, and any of your deficiencies become magnified. So if you are someone who is, say, and I'm using a hypothetical here, ambitious, ideological, somewhat unbending, supremely rational rather than emotional, so not the most empathetic or emollient or compromising or best political communicator. You get to the point where you think you've done good work to pursue a particular outcome, but you've got no concept of how it's going to be received. One of the other hats that I wear these days is I present a weekly news and current affairs programme on Times Radio on a Friday. And it turns out that the new Prime Minister likes to do things on a Friday. Whether that is to have her Chancellor announce a mini-budget or to hold a press conference announcing that she has fired her Chancellor for implementing her ideas in a mini-budget. And on the day that Kwasi Kwarteng stood up and unveiled his mini-budget, the pair of them were absolutely righteous in their belief that this would work and that the economy was plagued by low growth, so that tax cuts would stimulate that growth. And that energy bills were a pressing political problem and were putting up inflation, so we put money towards those bills. And that borrowing had historically been cheap, so we'll just borrow and pay for both sides of the balance sheet. But I think the hubris from all of this was not talking to the people that you want to borrow from. It's quite important. And for thinking that you can break all the old rules and you can try to, in one bite, practice Reaganomics, but without being the currency of last resort. That you can rely in the international money markets, the Bank of England, and 100 other stakeholders to play their part in your grand vision without rolling the pitch or even talking to them first. And then when the markets react, you be belligerent in your response because you warned them that you were going to do most of this over the summer, so what was the problem? And still, even now, refuse to properly acknowledge and atone for making things harder, more worrying, more expensive for the country. And I'm sorry to say to the Prime Minister, but I'm not sure that a third-person passive mistakes were made is really enough. Because the mistakes didn't happen in a vacuum. They were made. You made them. Take the ownership. Acknowledge your actions mean that people have to take more difficult decisions now over their own lives, over how they pay a mortgage, how they get a mortgage, over how they finance their business, over how they keep the lights on, over the cost of borrowing for any one of 100 things that they need to do. Now, I know that we're running late. None of you are here for a history lesson, so let's take a look at kind of what happens next. And I will give you the caveat that this is not my desired outcome. This is just what I see as the most likely. And also, another caveat, there is no precedence for where we are. Firstly, I think the appointment of Jeremy Hunt as Chancellor and the initial action that he's taken have steadied the ship to a degree, but only to a degree. The main service that he needs to perform for the country is to rebuild trust in UK PLC as an economically sound actor on the world stage. And that means that all the leeway we used to have in terms of running a current account deficit or the low rates at which we used to be able to borrow to invest are gone. We are now under the microscope internationally like never before, and everything becomes more exacting. Secondly, the government and the Bank of England have to come much closer to the same page. When you have economic and monetary policy pulling in two different directions, something has to give. And the markets obviously decided that the Bank of England had more authority. It was executing a more coherent strategy in attempting to combat inflation than the new government, who announced that they were both going to borrow to cut taxes without properly speaking to and warming up investors, stakeholders, and other countries who rely on international partners being solid and not flaky. And I think if you look at Biden's intervention just the other day, we might look at that and in this country think, do you know what, mate? Sod off. This is internal. Stick to your knitting. You stay over that side of the Atlantic. We stay over here. But I don't think that his intervention was unrelated to Goldman Sachs CEO David Solomon overnight coming out saying there's a good chance of a recession in the US, with the Amazon chief Jeff Bezos liking, the clip of David Solomon saying that, saying it's absolutely right, it's time to batten down the hatches, and the protests that are happening over there about inflation running now at 8.2%. Biden wasn't speaking to Britain when he said that. He was speaking to his own domestic audience. He was getting his defence in early for his own more orthodox approach to managing the US economy in the fierce global headwinds that we're all going to face. So sorry, that was a bit of an aside. So in terms of what Jeremy Hunt is trying to do now, he's absolutely trying to roll the pitch for the harsh medicine that the UK is going to have to take. But I think the problem that we're about to see in the coming days is who has the authority to make Britain take that medicine. because it's really easy to say euphemisms like reduced public expenditure. But unfortunately, what that means is things like job losses, lower than inflation pay rises, or sometimes both, because people's wages are such a massive part of departmental spending. The Chancellor is saying things like nothing is off the table, including things that were previously agreed, like 2 years of help on energy reduced to 6 months. So all those anxious people who breathed a sigh of relief a month ago are back having sleepless nights again on how to keep the heating on for their family, while at the same time, the fact that inflationary forecasts that said if there wasn't intervention on energy would say inflation would go to 15%, brought that down. Now, where do those inflation forecasts go? We've seen 10.1% today, higher than we expected. Where does it go now that the 2 years of support to reduce energy bills isn't part of that inflation picture? Hunter also says we need all departments that have to find savings. But then there's a big question about those departments that were told their budgets were going up, like health. They were told COVID means the backlogs are massive. We've got over 7 million people waiting for operations. We need to get that number down. We're giving you more money to batter through those operations. What happens to that? Defence. The Russian invasion of Ukraine changed the entire, what we thought about European and global security. We were told that we had to play our part. As one of the senior members of NATO, we have to shoulder a bigger burden of that. We were promised 3% by the end of the decade. What now happens to that? And then there's the political aspect of this, because you'll see in terms of the comment pieces, the idea of sidelining a Prime Minister, letting the Chancellor take the centre stage for the moment, might work in the ultra short term. It is not a sustainable policy in the medium to long term. It does not rebuild the UK's standing in the world. It does not reassure markets that stability in one of the world's greatest economies is restored. And politics, by its nature, completely abhors a vacuum. Without a defining mission or a mandate to bind it together, individual MPs will exercise their own autonomy to do what they believe is right on any given subject. And they'll argue to themselves, and why not? They don't believe that an immediate election promotes stability. They don't believe that changing horses so soon does anything but diminish the country yet further. They don't believe that the Prime Minister's position is recoverable, and it's not. So they're faced with absolutely no good choices. So we're in this place at the moment where a lot of MPs are slightly willing and wishing that they can get onto another fiscal statement on the 31st and that something will happen to shore everything up. But they by and large know that keeping a Prime Minister without any authority is unsustainable, but they've got no agreed position on who should take it over or even how that should and how that change can be got about. So in terms of steps that I think are going to shake them out of delusion, I think there's some things that are going to happen very, very quickly over the next 12 to 14 days. Firstly, take today. What time is it? 12:11. At the moment, the Prime Minister is up in the House of Commons, having only her third Prime Minister's questions, only her third. And the Commons is an absolute bear pit. It should be an open goal for Keir Starmer. The Prime Minister's prospectus has been absolutely shredded. The Commons is completely unforgiving. She's not a Boris Johnson that can just march in there and bluster her way out of it. She's not going to be able to put on a thicker skin and throw the attack back. That's not her speaking style. If we remember to what I was talking about in the beginning, she only had 14% of just the Tories in the Parliament, that she was their first choice, and she's burned through that political capital faster than anyone I've ever seen in my political life. However, the flip side of that is the expectations are higher on the opposition. It is not enough to score a tap-in. This is one of those ones where Keir Starmer has to, do a reverse pirouette and bicycle kick the ball on the half-turn volley into the back of the net, like that really amazing Wayne Rooney goal that we saw about 10 years ago. And depending on which newspaper you read, tomorrow the assessment will be, she can't go on, the game is up, or actually, she didn't do that bad. She's on day-to-day survival. The life support machine has not yet been cut off. But that leads us on to what are the threats for the next few days. If a Prime Minister's position is weak, it means other people think that their position is strong. Politics is always a zero-sum game on things like that. So you have already seen the Secretary of State for Defence, Ben Wallace, and his Deputy, the Armed Forces Minister, James Heappey, saying that if you go back on the 3% of GDP, we will resign. That is absolutely a resigning matter. We will walk. We will bring down your government. You know, it'll be awful. The other people to watch are Chloe Smith at the Department of Work and Pensions and Therese Coffey at the NHS. They have huge spending. At the moment, neither of them are saying anything other than we need to work in the country's interest. But I actually feel quite bad standing here, and I find it distasteful to be talking about this in terms of who to watch in Westminster, because if you think about what they do, that's talking about people on benefits and how much money they've got to feed their children. That's talking about people that have waited 2 years for an operation on whether they will get it in the next year or not. And it's also why you have to remember that politics is so important, why it's hard, and why there's such a responsibility to get it right. The next thing you have to watch is the backbenchers that stick their head above the parapet. We've already seen Stephen Crabb, Maria Caulfield say, I will not vote, flat out, will not vote to take away the triple lock on pensions. Today, while I was sitting here, the government has done something that I believe is an unbelievably self-immolating piece of stupidity on their part, which has made a vote at 7 p.m. tonight on fracking a government confidence motion, has given every Tory MP a 3-line whip. Anyone that was off because they were sick or they were abroad or whatever is being called back to the Commons. They have to vote on this they will say to stop the Labour Party taking control of the order paper at Parliament. People at home will only hear that after having a manifesto saying they weren't going to frack, they're now going to lift the ban on fracking. There are lots of people, not least the Chancellor, who has an oil field and a gas field in his constituency and doesn't have a huge amount of majority, who are going to be very, very unhappy at this. And I think you'll see a rebellion tonight. You might even see an Environment Minister or other resign over it. So things could move really, really fast. The next thing are agents outside of government. You have to look at what's happening in the country. Currently, right now, the government is trying to keep inflation down because 10.1% helps nobody. It harms everybody. It makes everything harder. Food inflation at over 14% harms everybody. One of the ways you keep inflation down is by keeping wages down. But then that means people are less able to pay for all of these things. So you've got strikes. At my last count, it was postal workers, rail workers, port workers, telecoms workers, teachers, NHS workers, bin workers and coffin makers today have all either started or announced that they will start industrial action. And yesterday, we had the head of the TUC, Francis O'Grady, saying the TUC was going to act as some sort of broker to try and coordinate the strikes to make the disruption as the most impactful that it can possibly be. And I think it's almost impossible for any government to argue that it should keep going and that it has the answers and that it is turning the economy around when normal people at home can't get to the work, their post hasn't arrived, their bins are stacking up and their kids are jumping on their heads because the teachers are on strike. Almost impossible. And I think all of this whole trying to get from day to day to day means that you have no strategy. You're just in survival mode. And every government needs to have a strategy, it needs to have a mission, it needs to have a vision, because it doesn't just get you through the days and the weeks, it helps other people do their jobs, because ministers and department heads then know what it is that their long-term goal is. They can take decisions before it gets to number 10 rather than referring everything to number 10, and that becomes a bottleneck. It also means that you've got a better communication. You don't send ministers out to do the daily round not knowing what the line is, not knowing whether they say we're going to back X policy or Y policy, because as soon as they don't know and they try not to land their colleagues in it, all you get is journalists, like I used to be, rather naughtily saying, government refuses to defend, government refuses to back, government didn't deny X, Y or Z, and you set a million hairs running. You also, if you've got a decent strategy, probably don't announce a massive swinging bunch of cuts for Halloween when the papers write themselves. I mean, again, we're talking the basics here. So what happens now? Personally, I don't think this is survivable for the Prime Minister. I think that we are talking in days and weeks, not in months. In terms of a change of leader, I think it will be messy. We heard Michael Gove say yesterday in another private event that somehow managed to make its way into the public eye, said that he thought it would be some kind of papal conclave. And in terms of not black and white smoke, I think it will be decided among MPs. I'm not among their number, but the idea that you can then have the several months process we had over the summer, I think is for the birds. You just can't have it. I think the factions within the Conservative Party right now are almost ungovernable. I think if Labour pick their timing right, there will be a vote of no confidence. I think there are enough members of Parliament within the Conservative that take the Conservative whip that they will survive that, but the Parliamentary Party will see that it's got to move on. And also hang over all of this, there's no need to have an election till late 2024, early 2025. You can have it as late as January in 2025. So there needs to be broad agreement on a successor before the trigger is pulled on Liz Truss, but there isn't, and everybody agrees or will get to the point where they accept that she has to go, but I think it's going to be like that very famous phrase about bankruptcy. It's going to be very slow before it becomes very fast. The other factor you've got to consider is the Labour Party. Are they ready to govern? Now, I believe Anne was saying that they're not ready yet. That would be my assessment. I think they are now scrambling to be ready. They see that a very clear path has opened up for them, and you know, straws in the wind, like allowing Sam Tarry not to be reselected, very left-wing, not to be reselected, and being deselected in his seat was a straw in the wind, that they're getting themselves ready, changing their HQ, getting rid of sacking a chief of staff to Keir Starmer that was considered to be underperforming. It really looks as if they've realised that they need to kind of pull their socks up. The next thing that you should see from them would be starting to get to the more populist pledges that people can remember. They saw that the energy windfall tax worked for them. It was kind of nicked by the government, but they need a few more of those, and I would expect that you'd see that quite soon. So I realise I've taken up a huge amount of time and we are running late. I did have a passage talking about businesses and ESG commitments and all the rest of it. I think I'll leave that to the Q&A because I worry that I have slightly depressed you with being so downbeat about the quality of politician that we have in high office at the moment. As a recovering politician myself, I do beg your indulgence and hope you excuse it. When he was Foreign Secretary, Boris Johnson once told me that being Foreign Secretary was like being trapped in a steel condom. And I did think to myself, how would you know? But once you break out, the freedom is intoxicating. And the reason that I've been so kind of clear-eyed and clear-sighted and haven't gilded the lily is because I actually believe that politics still matters and that public service matters and that a moderate kind of moral leadership matters. And that trying to take the country with you as you do things, even hard things, all of that matters. And I've spent my entire political life fighting for wider unions and for better working together. And right now, you, the people at home, everyone, deserves better than they're getting. But I think if I did have words of hope before we get to the Q&A, I do believe that this will pass, that good people in Parliament, in boardrooms and workrooms and schoolrooms and everywhere across the country will stand up to be counted. And I do hope that you, individually and collectively, will be one of them. Thank you very much. So, because I'm so short, I can't see the clock from where I'm standing. So if I do just lean over, it's to check how we're doing for time. Does anyone have a question that they'd like to ask? Gentleman over here.
Hi there. Can I ask you a question about Scotland?
Please.
My business, and I suspect quite a lot of other businesses in the room, are quite nervous about investing in Scotland because of political risk. And that's obviously been ongoing for quite a long time. It starts at probably a sort of -1 for a lot of us. I'm not entirely convinced that politicians in Scotland and perhaps in the rest of the UK quite understand that. And I'm also not entirely sure they understand the consequences of it. I hope I'm wrong. Maybe you can give me some reassurance.
I think there are some politicians that don't understand it. I think there are some that choose, because it fits their political narrative, not to understand it. I think, to reassure people, I would encourage, I think there are amazing opportunities in Scotland, and if you are considering investing in it, I look very seriously, and please do. I think in terms of the political outlook, you know, a nationalist party that has in its first line of its constitution that it wants an independent Scotland will always argue for that, and that party has been in government now since 2007, which is, you know, 14 years is a very long time. And my worry has always been down the years that seeing a First Minister of Scotland say that makes you think that the whole of the country thinks that, and it doesn't, and it quite clearly doesn't. At the moment, only 7% of people think that another referendum is a priority in Scotland. In terms of having one next October, as is the current government policy, that is completely for the birds. And it's obvious because, you know, there would be a whole lot, if they really thought they could win the case at the Supreme Court and get this done in October of next year, they would be a lot further down the campaigning route than they are. And they're not. And it's a real, do you know, it's a real kind of emperor's new clothes. What's interesting is that the commentators in the Scottish press have started saying, this is not going to happen next year, why are we indulging this? There was an economics paper that was launched on Monday, slightly overshadowed by what Jeremy Hunt had to say in terms of UK news, but the big kind of new economic prospectus case for Scotland that was roundly savaged, not just by sort of pro-union people and economists, but also SNP outriders that were like, look, we've had, you know, the best part of 20 years to come up with something. What are we doing about currency? What are we doing about pensions? Why haven't you got the answers to this? So I understand, completely understand, that the risk registers of people flashing in big red lights when they look at Scotland and the political situation. But I would counsel you to, you know, to take soundings from people that operate there every day who are already investing there, and to consider it, because we've got, you know, a highly educated workforce, we've got a huge amount of natural resources. We may not have the current administration that's the most pro-business I've ever seen in my lifetime in Scotland, but as a country there are so many opportunities for businesses. So absolutely understand your concern, but please do look again. Yes, gentleman here. Oh no, sorry, actually Chris Ray's been handed a microphone. So do you first, and then we'll do that gentleman.
Kind of asked and answered, to be honest. So
all right, okay.
I have to pivot on my feet. Fracking, I didn't see that one coming, if I'm honest, so I was going to ask whether you had a view yourself on why is that suddenly headline news?
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, if I look at energy policy in the round, I think, my wife's Irish, so I'm going to come up with Irishism. In terms of the destination I want to get to, I wouldn't have started from here. The decision was made, actually there's a fantastic clip of Nick Clegg in the coalition government saying that they're not going to vote for new nuclear power stations because they wouldn't come on stream until around 21, 22. I'm just thinking, do you know, maybe if we'd had a bit of foresight then. And I think that what we've seen writ large in the last 6 months since the invasion of Ukraine is why you have to have a broad energy mix. You have to have renewables as part of that. You have to have gas as a transition away from fossil fuels as part of that. You have to have you know, more traditional fuels. You have to have nuclear. You may not like it, but you know, you have to have all of that. And I think that particularly in Scotland, there is a real kind of morality about saying that even if the UK government allows fracking to continue, we're in charge of planning and land use, so it will never happen here. When, you know, LPG is being shipped across the world from being fracked in America, then being put on tankers that are like powered by diesel, and then driven across, driven? What do we do with boats? Sailed across the Atlantic and brought in and unloaded, you know, in Grangemouth to feed our needs. And you know, it just seems to me that there's a large amount of international NIMBYism as well as local NIMBYism. And I think that having a government that is able to make longer term decisions rather than get through the next election cycle would be a welcome relief to a lot of people in this country. Now, sorry, gentleman there, yeah. And
Hi
any
there.
ladies, if you want to ask any questions. I know it's quite a gentleman-heavy audience, but do feel free to raise your hand. Yeah.
Hi, Rupert Snuggs from the International Property Securities Exchange. It is a gender issue. I did a lot of work in my previous employer on promoting equal parental leave, where you have same rights regardless of a parent on when you have a new child entering your home. How far do you feel that that would address the gender imbalance, not just in this sector, but across the country, across all sectors?
Yeah, actually,
by encouraging men to take more parental leave.
Yeah, no, I don't even think it's that. I mean, I think if there was a belief or acceptance that irrespective of your gender, you would be taking the same amount of time were you to have a child, I think it would transform the way in which people hire in this country. And I think some of the kind of not silent prejudices, but the kind of don't even know that they're having them. It's funny, one of the people I spoke to when I wrote my book is this woman that runs care.com. It's one of the biggest .coms in the world. She's a Filipino-American lady who also started a mentoring scheme in companies, wherein instead of having women mentoring other women, they had men specifically mentoring women within the company so that they saw them operating. So it wasn't a case of only having seen the presenteeism. And I think post-COVID, we actually have to have a big conversation about who's back in the office when they're back in, who's back in at the time their boss is in, and who then gets the quiet nod on things. And I think that having that sort of ability to put people in the process, takes away any of the kind of residual ideas that you have about, well, actually, I know Thomas asked him to do that project and he was really good at it and he really delivered, so we'll get Thomas to do the next project as well. And there's all these sorts of things that just happen inside big companies and big organisations. And you have to really break the mould on that. And one of my frustrations actually in policy is I think that the gender pay gap reporting that was brought in by Theresa May is one of the most lumpen pieces and least fit for purpose pieces of legislation there, because it uses a hammer to crack a nut and it doesn't do what it's supposed to do, which is help bring women up. And also the idea was that it was supposed to get people to focus on it. It was supposed to shame people if it had got worse over the time. Actually, it's doing none of these things. People now just do it because they have to, and it's a bit of red tape for business, but nothing happens at the end of it particularly. And you see big disparities, like airlines are terrible because most of their pilots are male and most of their cabin crew are female, and there's a big gap in what you get paid if you're a pilot and cabin crew. But it doesn't mean, because you're reporting that you can suddenly promote somebody from cabin crew to pilot. There's not a pathway there for you. So it does nothing to address where women are in the workplace. So yes, I absolutely commend you for that. I think it has to be more than just voluntary. I think if we got to the point where it was just the norm, where men and women took the same amount of leave, I think you'd see a huge difference of how workplaces act and how promotions occur. Ladies, come on. There must be some... Yeah, lady over there. Black jacket, glasses. Hello.
Probably loud enough anyway.
Yeah, I don't think I needed a microphone either, but they gave me one.
It says real estate, so the elephant in the room, planning. Gaze into your crystal ball for us. What could they do with the planning system? We've obviously heard commentary about housing targets or housing numbers, whatever you want to call them, being scrapped. A review of the NPPF was supposed to come.
Yeah. So, God, I've been so depressing today. I am so sorry. I don't see anything except things that are already agreed, that have already been introduced, passing the House of Commons before the next election. There isn't the political capital to do it. I think the government is about to find out. It's going to be held hostage by any 35 Tory MPs that can get together and form a caucus on any issue. I think because we will, I believe, very shortly be on our third Prime Minister, we're 2 removes away from the last manifesto in which we were elected, so people within the Parliament will rightly say, what mandate is there for that? So unless it is something like, for example, the reversal of the NI levy that has Labour support, or something that is universally popular within the Conservative Party and its majority, it will struggle to get through. So lots of things that you've heard talk about, like changes to selling off Channel 4, not going to happen, not enough time, not political capital, not going to be introduced. In terms of half of the budget measures that are being trialled at the moment, I mean, I do not understand, I cannot understand why the government is taking the hit on even raising the idea that the triple lock on pensions might be rescinded, because they will not get that through the House of Commons. And even if they did, which they won't, they will not get it through the House of Lords. So why take the hit on people thinking you're going to do that and thinking you're going to, punish pensioners when you can't physically do it? So in terms of planning policy, I think the best thing that you can do is to work within the structures that you currently have, because I don't see the capacity, the political capacity for any change in the next 18 months. And I'm sorry that that's not the answer you would have wanted, but I'm being honest. Like I said, I'm an ex-politician. Anybody else? And then I think, how many more do you want me to do? What are we doing for time? Yeah. Well, I think there was a couple of people that hand up, so do 2 more. Gentleman there. Yeah.
As an ex-politician, what do you think the future of the Conservative Party is?
Well, I think the polls aren't looking great. And actually campaigning was kind of the bit of the job that I was probably best at, in terms of being able to read polls and mosaics and sort of get down into the kind of granular detail of how you can move votes. I have never seen numbers like Liz Truss's, -70 in terms of an approval rating. I think 7 points above Vladimir Putin, but only 7 points. When I say irrecoverable, I take no pleasure in that. I take no glee in that. I didn't back her, but I love this country. If a prime minister does well, the country does well. I want any prime minister to do well, whatever stripe they are. I think the belief within the party is that if we can stabilise things, and if there's a stretch before the next election, the kind of 25, 30-point differences that you see at the moment will close. I think that's probably right. But I think the idea of a 5th term is going to be quite tricky. Let's put it that way. And I think the Prime Minister's assertion that she'll lead us into that election, I think, will be tested. And last question then. Yep, no? Oh, yeah. Here we go.
Easy one to finish. Who's more likely to be Prime Minister first, Boris Johnson or Mick Lynch?
I think you get good odds on both of them, but I'm not a betting woman. Well, maybe a side bet. But I think it's called insider trading when you do it on politics. No, I would doubt that the former Prime Minister Boris Johnson would come back, and you can only pick a Prime Minister from within the Commons. So I'm going to play a straight bat to your very funny question and not be caught out with a headline. Thanks very much. Cheers.
Ruth, thank you very much for that. Lots of food for thought. I didn't think you were too depressing. I'm sure somewhere in there you said something very optimistic about the future of the UK as a democracy. I think there was about half a minute on that. Look, we've had global insight, economic insight, new priorities across established new sectors, some societal issues and some fabulous political insight. It's been, hopefully you've enjoyed the conference. Very grateful to all the speakers who have attended. I think it's been very enjoyable. Sorry it's run over slightly, but could we just have a big hand for all the speakers, please? Just a very quick thank you to the team here that organised the event, Agnes, Amy, Andrew, Chris, Pav, Abby, Chris, Candice, Claire, and Kieran as well. I don't know if Kieran's in the audience today. He's stood up and spoken at these events before. He's now very much focused on developing our international client base, especially our Asian Pac business. Thanks to him, because he's taught us an awful lot about how to do these things, and I now know how much work these things involve. So thanks to them. Most importantly, a huge thank you to you for turning up today. I hope you enjoyed it. Both here and online. All of us at CMS are very grateful for you attending, and hope you have a lovely afternoon. There is lunch, I think, on both sides. So for those of you who want to stay for lunch, please join us, and it would be good to hear about your new priorities. So thank you very much.